And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room tonight already. Of course, tonight I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, the sirens are going out there.
They are.
It's hard to live in the urban jungle, as they say. One of the things tonight is going to be a very special night. We have X Series 135 for you, and this is going to get us deep into a topic which has kind of rises and falls in terms of alternative media. And it has a scientific component, it has a mystical component, and also it's deep, deep in the mystery school tradition. And that is all about the pole shift, and also in history and coming soon to a planet near you. And also in relation to what we are looking at with what they used to refer to in the original mystery school texts as the sixth root race, and which was upgraded somewhat by Rudolf Steiner when he talked about the epoch, the new epochs that were upon us, and how I'm going to suggest that actually something called net, new epoch types, is going to be something that is going to help us with the terminology there, since there's so many curveballs. And it is very interesting when they talk about these root races, because at some points we hear we're going into the sixth root race. At other points we hear for theosophical and anthroposophical ways that we're going into the fifth. But in theosophy, we're already in the fifth, going into the sixth. So we have to figure out why they're counting it different in these different traditions. And I guess the kind of singular way to think of root races is just in terms of humanity as a tree. And these are very interesting because they're sort of epochs where we develop different faculties. As you know, in the story of Edgar Cayce, when he goes in a retrocognitive rant all the way back to Atlantean times, he is looking through the eyes of the Atlanteans and seeing that they aren't very hard compressed into matter. They're much more floating above the physical being, hanging out largely in the ethereal realm above the body. And that's quite interesting because that's a whole epoch of time before we became a lot more concretized as we are now. And now is supposedly the hardest into materiality that we've been, and we're coming into a lift back out. So this could be interesting. And we're going to see also how this whole thing about root races and mystery schools gets right into all the tampering that's going on with genetics and human DNA in relation to so many projects around the globe, where a very small band of people are attempting to alter humanity's trajectory, and not, I'm sorry to say, for the best purposes, as we know and as we've studied here. Of course, in the second half of the program tonight, we're going to be taking your questions, and Miss Olivia is going to be putting those together, and you can ask away at any time, and she's going to compile that. And we're going to go a couple hours tonight and just dive in hardcore in this X Series 135. Miss Olivia, before I go any further, how's the temperature out there?
You know, it's interesting. A lot of people are complaining about headaches, which may have something to do with solar activity.
Solar activity, yes. Well, you know, it's interesting. I don't think that that end of things is studied enough. And I think that it's intentionally obscured, and that we should know a great deal more about the solar interaction. But, you know, I recall something, since we have some Cayce in the program tonight, along with J.G. Bennett and Helena Blavatsky. But I do recall something that Cayce said in relation to sunspots, and that they related to communications on Earth in this way. And it came about as a result of human beings conflicting with each other, and it was directly reflected in the sunspots. So this is a very interesting thing for us to contemplate as well, which is these things coming at us from the outside world. Very often people are like, well, you know, Planet X is coming in, or there's some kind of catastrophe that's going to befall us. When in fact, it's more about mental preparation and, you know, for any situation. But I also feel that these types of things we have to be careful with as well, because they can be conjured up as well. So all the kind of fixation around disasters and disaster movies and, all those types of things that we hear about. It's funny because someone sent me an email and they were outlining all the things that were going on with the world. And it was interesting to me because if you're headline driven, if you're absorbing too much digital information and digital news and things like that, then they're going to be playing with what they would call in traditional theosophy and lower chakra activity. They're going to be hitting you at your baseline fear levels, and there's no way to expand that way. So we don't start off on that foot. We certainly consider the toughest and the darkest situations that are going on, but we hardly see, through rose-colored glasses on one hand, or through the kind of fear porn world. And that's something that I think we need to be aware of, because so many shows are into that 24/7 political thing. They have to dish out the conflict, and they have to dish out where the fear points are to drive the interest. But we take a very different tack on this when you're coming at it from an X series angle, which is the kind of work we do in dark journalism is informative around these subjects so that the mind gets a chance to consider these things in a balanced fashion and intentionally takes the hype out. That's not easy when you're reporting on these things because they are so hype driven. I mean, when you're dealing with the black budget or techno slavery, transhumanism, I mean, these are, very charged subjects. So we're trying to put them in a perspective and just come right down the middle on it to give you something that is insightful and sees with a wide angle lens. And we take a lot of historical trips and they bring them right into the present with some of the best experts as well. So that's what we're trying to do here on this. So when we talk about the pole shift tonight, it's not to be afraid that, the poles will shift and everything will be destroyed. It's more, why is that reference? Why is that warning there? Why is it left there? Why is it in the Cayce material or in the Steiner material, in Blavatsky's work? Elizabeth Clare Prophet made plans against us. Why? What is that sense that's in there? And it goes all the way back to biblical times. It's something big and bad is going to happen, and you have to be ready. Well, that's a pretty Noah's Ark theme. And there's in the Bible, there's Joseph, and he has that incredible interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. And Pharaoh has this dream about these 7 cows that are all well fed and look fantastic, and they're right next to these 7 skeletal cows. And Joseph interprets the dream and says, well, the 7 skeletal cows are lean years that are coming in terms of famine and things like that. So what you do is you take these 7 years with the fat cows and you store everything up. So there is this kind of storing things up, and this gets across on a material sense. We all understand the idea of people prepping and things like that. But let's take it on another level, which is if you have to preserve, let's say, knowledge in relation to society or humanity, how would you do that? Well, groups would probably get together to do it. And then they'd have to have a kind of a code or a bond of secrecy in relation to it. Or else if everything that they were doing became common knowledge, people might try to prevent them from doing this. So ideas around religion and the mystery schools and things, we start to understand them a little bit better, and we just break them down into these concepts. And somehow those examples are left vouchsafed for us back there, even in biblical stories. David and Goliath is one I like to bring up very often. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 135. We're going to go deep tonight on the pole shift and the 6th root race revealed. Is that a psychic future coming at us in the distance? Is it a hopeful humanity? Does humanity win and move on spiritually? It looks like it's a bumpy ride, but there's a lot of very good possibilities coming forward. We're going to be taking your questions, like I mentioned in part 2 of the program. And I want to remind you also to go, if you're new, to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter, which is a free newsletter and keeps you informed and in touch with all the exciting X series episodes, special reports, interviews, really fantastic interviews coming up for October, and maybe even some documentary stuff before the year's over. All right, before I jump into it, Miss Olivia.
I just, I'm probably going to use these as my quotes of the night, but I wanted to share.
Yeah.
Moments Divine said, "Don't let the cabal's demonic deeds demoralize you." And Jay Vanderbest said, "So true. Fear consciousness is so toxic." Just say, like, we're discussing some really intense stuff. The energy is very thick, very intense to navigate through. I've
really
been
true.
feeling it absolutely very kind of, I felt better today, but it's fairly hopeless. I was really, the entrainment was really getting to me. But it feels better being in the ideas room with everyone. I actually feel my energy lifting, and we have to support each other in all of this. And I guess the answer to all of this is about community and love and sharing. And it just, we're not alone. They want to convince us that it's every man for himself, right? And then we feel alienated and alone and hopeless, but we're not.
Wow, is that true?
We have each other.
So are you saying you have high hopes? Is that the idea?
I'm feeling better now.
This is good news. Well, I know exactly what you mean, and I would agree that the portrayal of this period in society, when it's looked back, when they look back on it, part of the propaganda is going to be the demoralization aspect of this on humanity. And I have to say, I don't think humanity has been targeted like this with this kind of technology before. So it is unique, the kind of situation that we're facing. And it does come from those leadership levels down, as we discuss on this program often, whether it's the manipulation of the UFO file by intelligence groups. And there's a story on that tonight, which I'm going to get to right in the open. Or political manipulation by deep state activities to get groups and political groups to fight with each other so they can sort of run off with the power and the missing trillions in the background. These are the types of things that are coming out more and more into the open. But I think the issue is just the heavy duty control around the electronic communications and the social media groups, et cetera. So it takes, you are walking in a minefield very often, but certainly a good, solid intuition on this takes you through, guides you through, as it were. So there's a lot of reason for optimism here in the fall of 2022. All right, before we go with anything, I'm going to get into a couple of quick things right at the beginning relating to Russia. And Russia comes up later in relation to the mystery aspect of all this, but I want to just bring them up because they've been taking these very hard positions against us, and we've been provoking them with the whole Ukraine situation and $80 billion that America doesn't have, and all these weapons and things. And who's really making out here? Well, it's Boeing and all the defense contractors and Lockheed Martin with the Biden administration and that aspect of the deep state. It's really a psychotic situation that they've tripped into. And now, they have a psychopath running Ukraine, Zelensky, who was an actor and a comedian that they brought in to do this. And they wanted to get someone who they could, be relatable, so the United States populace would support this guy. But a lot of people see through him, especially with the past that he has. But this is interesting because one of the things that they're trying to do, and part of the reason of the provocation of the whole war, was to make Ukraine a NATO state. Of course, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance Organization, which is something that we developed during World War II to make sure that these nations stayed together and would fight, in the event that any of the NATO partners were attacked. We've kept adding different countries to this. And the problem is that, the security guarantees by the United States are just dramatic overreach in relation to this, and too much dependence on us. And it's one of the things that the Trump administration pointed out well, which is none of those countries are paying the United States to do this. And they're way behind in the amount of money. The Trump administration collected $500 billion in delinquent dollars from Germany and a number of the other EU countries. And you have to wonder, is this part of the reason for the savaging of the Trump administration? So this is very interesting to me because we're in a strange situation there where they're trying to provoke us into being into World War III with Russia, which is a crazy idea because, one, Russia's a nuclear armed nation. Two, they pose zilch threat to the United States. And so engaging with them on this level, there should be a dramatic international peace process. There's nothing like that anywhere. Instead, we get this whole violence thing going on. So we've seen a lot of support and ridiculous amounts of money, and every other day, the Biden administration is slipping a few more billions to their friends over there in Ukraine. And unfortunately, the people on the ground, both the Ukrainian citizens and the Russians, they're the ones who are taking the brunt of this, while these larger groups just sit on top. But anyway, Zelensky today says Ukraine will pursue fast-track application to join NATO. Now, if they're in NATO, then that means we have to defend them, which means if they're at war with Russia, that's World War III. So this guy is not thinking about the interests of the United States. He just wants, he's just playing his role for the World Economic Forum and other groups, the IMF and the deep state, really pushing this aspect of World War III with a nuclear-armed Russia, which is beyond absurd. Russia, for their part, they've made a lot of heavy moves, and a lot of this couldn't be well advised, in my opinion. And I would highly recommend that they go to the peace tables and call this off too. But what's happening is he now is annexing these regions, and they did have a vote there, and the vote was, hey, we want to join. But so this process is getting pretty wild. And then we have this situation where after Putin's land grab, Zelensky wants fast-track NATO membership. We cannot allow Zelensky and NATO, and with the Ukraine and NATO, that puts us in a firing war with a nuclear-armed Russia. It's suicide on both sides. It's absolutely crazy. So this is the kind of thing, we hear the pumping up of Zelensky as a hero and fighting off those invading Russians and all this stuff. What's more important from a foreign policy position is not to say we're right. It's just to say, how do you get to a peaceful solution? And you don't hear any of that with these people. Anthony Blinken, I mean, it's one of the worst Secretary of States in history. And he looks like an SNL extra or something.
Mm.
I mean, this guy's just sitting there, shell-shocked, no plans, nothing. And then all you ever hear them talk about, we've seen the incredible sabotage of the pipeline recently. If those things come back to the United States, that's an act of war. That's putting the entire country on a World War III footing, with a very powerful nation that's aligned with China. So it's a disastrous kamikaze, psychotic foreign policy. And so when you see Biden stumbling around on the podium and walking away and people laugh at him, it's really not funny, because whoever is pulling the strings is goading us into World War III. So we really have to be on top of that and let our congressional representatives, the senators, and everybody else know this is not what we're going to support. And there shouldn't be any more money for Ukraine under these circumstances at all, except humanitarian aid. They should be put in a position where they develop the incentive to have a peace treaty with Russia, because that's what they're going to need, because Russia's going to win. That's the inevitable outcome. They're a better military, they're a more powerful nation. And is this going to be Vietnam, where we just keep providing arms and eventually troops, or is it going to be all out war? I mean, it's beyond insane. And so it's just been festering there in the background, and it's picking up steam. But anyway, from the Wall Street Journal, Ukraine's President Zelensky said Friday that Ukraine would apply for membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization through an expedited process. It's ridiculous. And for him, this is a real psychopathic move, because he knows it creates World War III. So especially fast track, you're in the middle of a war, and NATO is automatically bound if any of their members are being shot at to shoot back. So that's us. So the minute he gets his NATO authorization, then that puts us, legally by treaty obligated to fire at Russia. That's ridiculous. I mean, it's really crazy. I can't explain to you just how over the edge they've got. And, they're just kind of humming this off in the media, that Putin, he annexed whatever, and so we need to give fast track motion and threaten them with, nuclear arms. You're crazy. These people are nuts. We're not going to shoot nuclear weapons. God, no. Like, we don't even know the repercussions. And, you can't engage in a nuclear war with Russia. This is insanity. And it's a neocon's wet dream. And we really need to shut these guys down. Okay. So he applies for an expedited process. And this is his quote: "We are de facto allies. This has already been achieved," he said. In other words, you should be fighting for me and engage the world in World War III, all because I won't give these pieces back to Russia. And, that's not a desirable situation, but neither is World War III. So you're going to have to engage in some kind of peace process instead of just having us give you billions and billions of dollars and engage the United States in war that we don't need and is not in our best interest. And honestly, I think our aid in relation to Ukraine at this point should be humanitarian. So Mr. Zelensky also rejected Russia's annexation of Ukrainian territory in a video address on Friday afternoon, and he met with top military and security leaders to discuss ways of countering Russia's supposed annexation. The Ukrainian president's office said, "The entire territory of our country will be liberated from the enemy not only of Ukraine, but also of life itself, humanity, law, and the truth." Look, Ukraine has good reason to hate Russia and vice versa, so that stuff, we've seen it before. It's like the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And so we have to have a definite policy of peace in relation to that. I mean, Ukraine's pretty far away. Are we going to engage American troops for Ukraine? This just, strikes me as beyond insane. And it's the invitation to nuclear war. And then you have to wonder, who's cooking that up? Who wants to see nuclear weapons used? So we have to be really hardcore with our own representatives on this. No more money for Ukraine until there's a real peace process in place and they're willing to do something. Because, just giving them billions of dollars, God knows, that's probably just money laundering at this point. And it doesn't belong in any aspect of America's foreign policy at all. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going to go deep tonight in relation to the pole shift and the mystery schools. But I'll tell you, what's interesting is that area of the world, the Ukraine and Russia, comes up quite a bit in the mystery esoteric tradition. So we're going to try to make some sense of some of the moves that are happening on the international stage as well. Now, we've done a little reporting on those. This is the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and they put together this logo, and everyone went bonkers last week. And it is this aviation logo, and it shows down there, of course, in that corner, as part of the official logo now, this here, that is a flying saucer. And it looks more like a Billy Meyer flying saucer. I know that Corbell and the marketing clowns were all like, it's a Lazar saucer. In fact, it looks like the kind of classic 50s one more than that. And then along with these very other kind of instructional ways of different aircraft that we possess, they're trying to show that. And I think the implication of this logo was to really test the public's will about this UFO aspect. But what's interesting to me is that, I also think the suggestion here is, as they fly through the hot zone, that we have this flying saucer hanging out down there. And the idea is, well, we've got this UFO threat coming up, so don't you worry about it. So when we see that kind of stuff, naturally, I think that we get very, very, based on the research that we've done in this program, that's another step in that whole UFO threat aspect. Now, what's interesting about all this is the next day after this went up and caused a craze, and, everybody in that whole UFO sphere was going nuts about this. And it's interesting enough. But also, you don't want to be like Pavlov's dogs when it comes to this stuff. Like, oh, the government did something on UFOs. Who cares? I mean, they're never going to give you the truth on UFOs anyway. But yeah, it's a news story. I get it. But let's watch the overreaction jumping up and down about that, because the government, if anything, has just been lying on this for 80 years. So the idea of getting the truth from the government on it is far and away, they're actually playing with that theme now. It's like, hey, we've been lying to you so long, but here's the truth. So, but one of the things I want to point out that showed up in the middle of this is Eric Weinstein is one of these kind of thought leader guys, Silicon Valley guys, and part of the whole Peter Thiel Capital piece. And it's his brother that does Dark Horse. And Dark Horse is that podcast that follows up on all the COVID stuff and talks to scientists. And what's it? Evolutionary biology?
Yep.
Yeah, that's what he does. And he does the show with his wife. That's actually a very good show. And this is one of the things that I warned about, which is that as the UFO thing gets opened up, suddenly you're going to see spooks explaining it to people. So here you have this thought leader in Silicon Valley, and he's been asking these questions in his Twitter feed about what is this UFO thing that's going on? And he doesn't have any background on the UFO thing. And who does he show up with but Lou Elizondo, CIA spook who pretended to be a UFO whistleblower. And now this guy, who we already know that they're going to replace probably because of all the different problems that he's had with Gary Nolan, who's another CIA guy, but he's a scientist and, works in immunology and is buddies with Fauci and that whole thing. But this guy, Lou, who everyone on this show knows very well, has been engaged in this UFO threat activity, created the phony TTSA whistleblower thing and all the rest. And here we have now the public asking questions. And here's what Weinstein says. Thought I'd get some help trying to figure out what the heck is actually going on. Thanks, Lou. Now, if you want to go to Lou Elizondo and the CIA for information about UFOs, be my guest. But you're supposed to be a thought leader. And this is what's going to happen. And this is why when you get Tucker Carlson talking to Nolan, who's working for the CIA, why do these people think? I mean, I understand the whole credential thing, but why do you think that you're going to get the truth from the Central Intelligence Agency? Have you had your head checked recently? I mean, that's just not going to happen. So that's probably the absolute worst place to go if you want anything pertaining to real facts around the UFO file. So we see a kind of a situation which I think that these people should be compelled to be more well-versed on the subject. And I've mentioned this before, even about Tucker Carlson or Megyn Kelly. They've done a lot of UFO stuff lately. Or CNN, which is doing the ridiculous things. They actually canceled their little Lou special. I wonder about that. It was Leslie Kane and Lou and all these people. And I think they just got rid of it. But for me, when I look at this is very important because, somebody like Tucker Carlson, he's after the truth. He does good reports on things, but he doesn't know jack about UFOs. And so for him to turn to the CIA's lead guy who's like, I'm a CIA agent and I'm a contactee and I'm also an immunologist. That's not where you're going to get the facts from. So to engage these people and to give them the platform, in my opinion, becomes very dangerous because what happens then is they're able to spin as far as the perception management program, what they want to put out there on this. So, those people need to be compelled to do the deeper research and to find opposing points of view and all the rest, as you would do on any other subject, and not let the CIA tranche through the entire media process. I mean, nobody who deals in alternative media would trust those guys anyway if they have half a brain. And, a lot of people, I'm seeing a lot of awareness around the CIA manipulation of the UFO file based on the work we've done here and, that other people have done, like Dr. Farrell or Gigi Young or a whole slew of people, Black Vault, a lot of these people have realized the extent of the CIA interference going on in this. But it's a crucial thing to keep an eye on, especially when you see that crisscross going on with the tech community or the scientific community. It's like, hey, I wanted answers on UFOs and I went to the CIA. And, when you look at the thread on that, if you look through the thread, you'll see a lot of the responses are like, why on earth would you go to the CIA for this? And that's really the attitude that we need. All right, Miss Olivia, before I go any further.
David Tormina, DJ, what do you make of Putin threatening to use weapons more advanced than nuclear?
Yeah, well, this is interesting because we know they have these incredible missile capabilities, and they do have these sonic weapons and the incredibly hypersonic missiles. So we know that they have that going on. The extra bit, it's been suggested before by Medvedev, and that was a while ago, that they had something else. And they know that we have something else. And in 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan discussed that something else and came out of their Reykjavik meeting with the whole zero option idea, which is no nuclear weapons at all. So obviously, if you're going to strip down on that level, then you're going to have something waiting in the wings that's going to defend you. So, but I think it's compelling. I actually think that his comments, Putin's, on the world stage are less bellicose, and they're more like, do you get, he's kind of saying, do you get the message? I think very often, and he's trying to get that word out. And he says, to Europe, I'm not against you, Europe. I'm against your leaders, etc. Now, this is a tricky thing because, I think that Putin's action in Ukraine is deplorable as well. So, but I think that they were forcing him into a situation by putting NATO on his doorstep, and through, and Ukraine acting very hostile. So we've had this back and forth going on, and there's been a war over Ukraine for quite a while. But, we have to look at the situation ourselves globally and say, who are the people that are trying to put us in a digital concentration camp? I mean, who are they? And, we equate very often people in the World Economic Forum in relation to this. So, that's much more important than any one particular country, one particular enemy, like Russia. And Russia could easily be, and were for a number of years, an ally, a competitive ally, basically. And, we've partnered up with them all the way back to World War II and beyond. And then we had this massive kind of Cold War expanse that went on for decades, even though incredible presidents like Kennedy and Reagan try to unplug this process. So there's an element inside of both countries that likes and benefits from this. And it's a global situation. And that's why things like Lockheed Martin and like Boeing and like that circus that they create to get these war sales going has to be exposed further and further. We saw it all. If you go back to Nazi Germany and the war that we had going on there, there's all the trading with the enemy activity where, the companies over here were giving them the nuts and bolts to make their tanks to roll across Europe. I mean, we have to be real about this stuff. So it has to be called out in terms of where it's coming from. I think that's the most important thing. And so, we're not happy with Putin and the things that he's doing, but what are we doing on our side? Have we created a general peace process to say, what, even Kissinger of all people said Ukraine's going to have to cede some of that territory, and they're going to have to create a peace process. Well, that's even the old deep state corrupt guard. So what is it that's on top that even opposes that? We have to wonder just what kind of a freak show that we're involved with. And are they looking to get us all, into some sort of nuclear situation? So it needs to be looked at and really stopped now, I would say for sure.
Okay. Matakwe Oyasin, does DJ think Putin is threatening the use of scalar weapons? And Najat Madri says, what are the chances that there will be a covert war before a full deployment of the military war?
Well, this is very interesting because, I think the pipeline aspect, and, you get people like John Brennan out there saying they did it to themselves, because all guys like that can think about are false flags because they pull them all the time for the CIA. So, we have to wonder sometimes who's the real enemy here. I mean, the Central Intelligence Agency may be dogging us all into war, and there may be elements inside Russia that want that also. These are the things, we have the ability, being a nation with power and, with those connections globally, to create the kind of peace process that everybody can get behind. But our country doesn't want it. And that's very disturbing. And I think there are representatives that do, and I think there are presidential candidates that do want us to get out of that situation in Ukraine. And so I think we need to move on that very fast. And the citizens need to let them know that we don't want all this money going to Ukraine. We don't want war with Russia at all. And if I could talk to the Russian government, I would say, you know, you're making it twice as bad for yourselves and us, because there's a certain point at which nobody can back off. So everybody needs to go to a neutral corner and develop some kind of a real peace process, as has happened in a number of situations before. Why is this Ukraine thing so unique? It makes you wonder, and it makes you wonder about all the biolab stories and the Hunter Biden money laundering stories and all the rest of it. So, whatever these corrupt politicians have in mind, we don't want any party of it. I guess that's our answer on that. Sorry, I could have been a shorter answer, but hey.
Do you want another one? Lucy Rain wants to know, are we actually in the war of all against all yet, or is that a delight yet to come?
Well, this is an interesting thing, and it comes to us directly from anthroposophy. But in anthroposophy, and it's the cosmology of the thing, the Ahrimanic forces want us to be in this continual war, and ultimately results in the war of all against all. But what he says is very interesting when he talks about it from this kind of spiritualist viewpoint. He's looking at it and he says, well, actually, the goal of the Ahrimanic forces, which they refer to a lot in anthroposophy, we've done a number of shows on it. The Ahrimanic forces are compelled to the point where they want the human body right side fighting with its left side. So if you think about it, we have enough of our own sort of psychological things that are going on, but there are outside forces that are very compelled to have us in war type footing. And I think that that's very interesting, to think that there are dark forces out there whose war concept is so deep on humanity that ultimately, your right side fighting with your left side is the ultimate. That's the war of all against all, the final outcome. So, but I think we're always at that precipice, and we've had incredible leadership and spiritual guidance before. I mean, you can look back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. That looked like a nuclear exchange. It looked like there was no way out, and it took President Kennedy's remarkable leadership, and I think he saved the world. He saved us from a nuclear exchange then. And although, forces inside the government and the Central Intelligence Agency assassinated him a year later, probably for taking those actions, in addition to some of the things he was doing around the UFO file and space, that, he still, in the grand scheme of things, like whatever it was that they were up to and doing that, like he saved humanity basically in that moment. So it takes that type of leadership and clear-headed, calm deliberation, and really calling in partners, which is something else he did. I don't see us calling in anybody for this. It's just, nonstop. There's no peace process going on, and there's bellicose rhetoric. And Zelensky's like, I'm going to fast track to NATO to make sure that you're obligated to defend me. No, I don't want that. I can't think of anybody with a brain who would want us to be obligated to defend Zelensky in Ukraine. As an ally, yeah, he would get a certain amount of protection, as we've done, and he would get a certain amount of support. But this is outrageous. This is a guy, the process behind Zelensky is trying to drag America into a nuclear situation with Russia. Who's behind that? That's the question that needs to be asked on it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, and these political moves, they are very disturbing. We're going to be going into now a good deal of information left to us about the pole shift and the sixth root race, and how there's a political aspect to this period that relates directly to this. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of the program, and as you can see, Olivia's dishing them out left and right. How's the vibe out there?
Very intense, for obvious reason.
Sure.
Before you move on, Slavic Gypsy said, Putin is stating the Satanism of the West and transgender agenda. What does DJ think about that?
Oh, I didn't catch the Satanism of the West. And you have to be careful with those quotes, because a lot of things ping pong around, although this could be true. But a lot of things ping pong around, putting words into people's mouths. If you don't have a source, with the quote or the meme or whatever, then don't even regard it as anything, because that's another way to get everybody, whipped up about things. So if you have a source for it, then it's easier to respond to it. But if he did say it, it's pretty interesting. I'll put it to you that way. Let's go into a few interesting things about the pole shift and how it was related in modern times by Charles Hapgood via Albert Einstein in the late 50s. And Hapgood's very unusual connection with, for example, the search for Atlantis, the Pyrrhus map, and some of these very rather esoteric interests, including being a lifelong member of the Cayce ARE, and also working very closely with somebody who was a self-styled mystic in the Cayce fashion, and working with him for decades, doing Cayce-style work. And that is Charles Hapgood. Hapgood stands out as somebody who really brought a lot to the surface and was working with depths of information that tell me there's something a little bit deeper with him that goes beyond just the fact that he was a good researcher. His connections are too vast. And, he's got Albert Einstein writing the foreword for his book. That's pretty good. And the book was all about Earth crustal displacement and an upcoming pole shift. And he was developing a theory that something happens over time, usually in the period of 12,000 years, where this accumulation takes place at the polar ice caps, and it causes a shift in space where the poles physically shift. And we also, we know there's a lot out there about a magnetic shift of the poles. This is interesting because I find so many of the articles about the magnetic shifting of the poles as a steganography for what's actually taking place, which is these people are aware of it too. But what's interesting is you find references to the pole shift throughout the esoteric literature dealing with the mystery schools, including in the Cayce work, Steiner, Theosophy, and it runs very deep. So we have this scientific aspect running on one side, and then we have this rather esoteric. And something tells me that they're both being informed by the same source. So now there's a book called Beyond Atlantis, which just does a little nice summation here about pole shifts. I'm going to read this. The idea of a pole shift originates in a talk given in May 1872 by French ethnographer Charles Bresset de Bourbourg, called Chronology of the History of Mexico. He interpreted passages in the Lost Codex that began around 10,500 BC. Again, here we're looking at that 10,500 BC period where Cayce indicated there had been a massive disaster that drove the Atlanteans into a massive egress into Egypt. And that's where the pyramid and the Sphinx and all that got built. And I have those readings because they reference directly the pole shift and relationship. But remember that date. 4 periods of cataclysm had changed the world, each caused by a temporary shifting of the Earth's axis. In the mid-1900s, Hugh Brown and Charles Hapgood proposed that shifts of the geographic pole could explain ice ages, mass extinctions, and other worldwide events. Hapgood proposed that an asymmetrical accumulation of polar ice created a force that caused the crust of the Earth to displace, i.e. slide over the mantle. Now, Einstein read his book and his original papers and said, you know what, I'm going to write the foreword for the book you're putting out, because he had heard some good things about Hapgood, and then they had this kind of back and forth, and those letters are still around and available, although the nature of that relationship, I would say, was even deeper than what's in the letters, and probably we'll never know the full extent of it. But the fact that Einstein went out of his kind of ivory tower of being this kind of godlike physicist in that world, everybody just, the theory of relativity, that he was it. For him to look at Hapgood's work around the pole shift, this is somebody who saw early on that if Germany got the atomic bomb before we did, it was all over for the world. So he was looking at these things, and I've also traced him very deeply over in relation to Caltech in my research that was going on, and some of the things that he was engaged in. And so I think we're dealing with a very deep player with Einstein. So for him to select Hapgood and say, I'm going to open up with this guy and I'm going to support his really what were considered far out theories about a pole shift in that period, pretty wild. Now, here's the question. Here's Hapgood as a scientist looking into this and doing this deep research. And now we also know, if we dig into his past a little bit, that he's a Cayce member, and that he's somebody who studied the Cayce readings and was around enough and writing letters to the Cayce Foundation before Cayce died. I don't have a record of him getting a reading from Cayce, but it's not off the table. So he could have been getting this pole shift piece directly from the Cayce material. What Cayce suggested was that the poles shifted, and it created a massive disaster situation for the Atlanteans. And that when that happened, you had huge inundations of the islands, that it had already been split. Now, he actually attributed the destruction of Atlantis to the Two-Eye Stone, which was their crystal power station. So the idea that it was just Earth changes that took Atlantis out is not what I'm suggesting here, but it's a major factor. And the level is recorded a flood legend. That's one of the destructions of Atlantis, according to Cayce. So that was a good stretch. That was almost a yoga stretch, if you catch the one. Cayce's work, I want to say the more I've read it for decades, but the more you get into it, the more it applies to this period that we're in. And I think what happened, Cayce's work, even though he died in 1945, and a lot of the really compelling readings start right in the 1920s. But I think what we're looking at with Cayce is, when you get to the 60s, there's a whole yoga, youth, and reincarnation type thing that happens. And his piece about Atlantis in the books The Sleeping Prophet by Jess Stern, who was a New York Times author, this is a guy who was getting incredible traction after his death. And they started to look at his predictions, because one of his major predictions had come true in relation to the Bimini Wall, when he said a piece of Atlantis is going to come up off Bimini, and they found the Bimini Wall. Now, what's interesting is he had made some other, during his career, some other predictions, like the Great Depression in World War II and the Kennedy assassination and things of this nature. So they have that whole thing. And so he got this name, the Sleeping Prophet. But Cayce did all kinds of readings relating to Atlantis. And in over those 14,000 readings, there's 900 about Atlantis. And there's a huge mass of readings that are just about medical situations. So, they're using him as a psychic diagnostician. So, the idea that Cayce's limited just to this prophet thing is something I think that they pushed heavily in the 60s and 70s. And so there was constantly headlines like, Cayce predicts Los Angeles going underwater. And he does predict that there'll be a great breakup of the West Coast. But I think that they were really pushing him in that era. And so, after the fact of people looking at this, just like they pushed 2012, and they were like, oh, the Mayan calendar says we're all going to be taken out in 2012. There's an indication in Cayce's readings, in the Mayan work, in the mystery schools, that something cataclysmic in the era that we're in is going to take place. But it seems like whenever publishers and people like that get a hold of it, they hit people over the head, and they want the fear porn thing because it drives this whole frenzy about it. And we know in the case of 2012, they did that whole movie with John Cusack, and it was like, it was
God, was that terrible?
It was a terrible movie. And, it made $800 million or something like that. But the upshot is all the elites land in South Africa, and it's like, we're going to have a new humanity and no more of those bad people who disagree with us. So, you got to wonder who's driving some of that stuff. but there's also an organic marketing process around this. So what I want to suggest with the Cayce aspect is that what he's saying, taking us into the 21st century, is that first, that human beings have control over their own destiny, and that if we can kind of create or cope with destructive activity, or we can create a different reality. He's giving us the ability to do that, but he's also looking out over these vast changes. And it's almost like a warning, like as a prophet, an Old Testament prophet would warn. So the Cayce story, in short, if you go back there, is he's a priest in Egypt, and he's around during this period when the Atlanteans are going down, and he goes there and he works with the holy men of Atlantis, and he brings the records of the Atlanteans to Egypt and buries them and creates the Sphinx and the pyramids to do that. And he creates a spiritual society in Egypt, and there's a whole intrigue where he's banned and they drive him off to Ethiopia and so on. And then he comes back and there's this incredible rule and all the rest of it. But it's coming out of a pole shift. It's coming out of a disaster. And so we start to see that somebody like Charles Hapgood, in looking at this material, could be thinking to himself, oh my God, there was a pole shift back there, and I'm going to do the scientific research that it takes to make this happen. Now, to his credit, also, Hapgood is an extraordinary researcher, and his book, I'm still reading, on ancient maps, is phenomenal. But of course, he discovered this whole situation about the Pyrrhus map. And basically what he put across on that was that it showed Antarctica before the ice. And so whoever was doing the cartography on this had some kind of global satellite to do it. And so now I've uncovered these records of him talking directly with President Eisenhower. And he's telling him it's so important to get the original copy from which this Pyrrhus map was derived. And I know that the Spanish government has it. And so there's almost an international incident over this. And the only thing that's left over from it are the very intense letters from the Eisenhower administration to the Spanish government looking for this map. So it's not polite language. It's like, we need that, and you need to supply it, that kind of thing. So I would say that whatever they found out in relation to the pole shift, in relation to the Pyrrhus map, and the situation that existed before was very important to them. On a political level, there's no other trail about what happens after the fact, or if they ever get the map. Supposedly they don't, but I would wonder about that. But Hapgood goes on, and as I said, he works with Elwood Babbitt, and Babbitt is like a trance medium in the Cayce fashion, and he continues to do this deep level of research. So the pole shift has now come into the public sphere of interest. Previous to that, in theosophy and anthroposophy and the Cayce work, they are looking out, and in the fourth way work, because J.G. Bennett is part of this also. They're looking out into the 21st century, and they're seeing a massive societal collapse and earth changes, disasters, and how society could cope with this. And in the 70s and 80s, there's some recognition that this is going on. There's a book called We Are the Earthquake Generation. And it's attached, it inspires this book, 5/5/2000, which was a big doomsday scenario type thing, which was driven by the Stell Group and these people who were preparing a society to survive, and was trying to enlist scientists and people to create this whole thing. And then the guy involved with that, Richard Kieninger, writes a book called The Ultimate Frontier in the 60s. And a lot of people are drawn to this, but it turns out, that it becomes kind of a sketchy commune type situation. And it doesn't live up to all the information that's in the book. And it's learned later that Kieninger was raised by a single mom, and she was going to these classes around Mount Shasta for the Lemurian Fellowship that were run by a Dr. Stell, which is very interesting because they use the name Stell for the Stell Group. And somewhere in that process, he absorbed a lot of very interesting information. And that's what comes out in The Ultimate Frontier, even though Keenanger himself turns into a colorful character. One of the things I like to point out about him is that David Hatcher Childress is one of the people who goes and lives there at Stell, and he actually forms a Sacred Places travel agency with Keenanger, of all things. And then Keenanger takes off. He gets booted out of Stell and starts some other community in Texas, gets into legal trouble, and then, you know, gratefully dies before he does anything else. But anyway, so this is from Jeffrey Goodman's We Are the Earthquake Generation, and it's a description of this pole shift and what would happen. And you could, you know, it's a fictional kind of thing, but this is his description. It is 5 p.m. in Boston, and the people rushing home from work hardly notice how the setting sun has hung on the horizon. After several hours, people start to wonder why darkness is not coming, and they start to fear the faint, dull roar they hear. Some also begin to feel light on their feet, and whether from the giddiness induced by the prolonged twilight or from the subtle gravitational and magnetic changes that the Earth's shifting in space is creating. Some have the I could jump over anything feeling. Animals act skittish, and then suddenly all start to move or migrate in the same direction. Then the sky reddens as huge clouds of dust begin to blot out the sun. Next, a steady wind starts to blow. As the wind strengthens, the faint, dull roar heard earlier grows even louder, as if the source were moving closer. But just then, a temporary stillness sets in, and the air seems like it is being sucked up by a gigantic vacuum cleaner. There is no sign of movement. After a few minutes, the winds are back, and even stronger. There are gusts up to 100 miles an hour. And he goes into this scenario, and it is the depiction based on what he's heard from scientists about what would happen if a pole shift happened. And they just happened to pick Boston. Isn't that comforting?
Weird.
I like that one. And he mentions it again. He goes, from Boston to St. Paul to Seattle to Anchorage, out come layers of mud spread for thousands of miles. So it's very interesting. And what's happening is there's this buildup about a pole shift. And suddenly the pole shift gets connected up with there's Doomsday 2000. Now, it's interesting because the mystery schools don't make a prediction that in the year 2000 there's going to be a pole shift. What they say is, you know, humanity is facing this off in the future and no one can set the date, you know, but this is part of what they're going to have to deal with in a couple of generations. And it's part of why the information is coming forward from these schools, which generally keep that information under lock and key. And we've described that process that took place in the 19th century before. So what I want to point out about this is that the pole shift idea has been taken on by groups, you know, and so in more modern times, you know, Bennett's group, which was a fourth way group, decided because of societal collapse, what they would do is develop the ability to be self-sufficient. They would farm and they would work with the fourth way concepts, etc., through things like the Claymont community. I want to read a couple of things that J.G. Bennett put out about this. And the whole idea of surviving a crisis in human affairs. Now, it's interesting because when we think about Bennett, we have to remember a few things. One, he was in military intelligence very early on, World War I, and his job, they sent him out to spy on Gurdjieff, who was doing different things for a Turkish prince and was, you know, doing these services for him. And they wanted to know who Gurdjieff was. And they were like, he's getting, you know, maybe Russia is sponsoring him. He's getting in between Turkey, UK relations. So when he goes to spy on Gurdjieff, he realizes, well, this guy's fascinating. And he starts to, you know, dig the philosophy and the things that Gurdjieff's putting out. Now, what's interesting is he goes to France and he studies with Gurdjieff. Then he ends up becoming for decades, a student of Ouspensky. And then he becomes a teacher himself, has a falling out with Ouspensky. Ouspensky dies. And then Gurdjieff says, "Where have you been all my life?" And he goes back to work with Gurdjieff for the last few years of Gurdjieff's life, and he's kind of the heir apparent of the whole Fourth Way schools. He's the one who's going to bring it out. So he has a very interesting career. But anyway, in the setting up of Claymont, what he does is he has a kind of an overview for what it's for, and he's setting it up in the 1970s. Just as he's getting rolling with it, he dies. I think it's at the age of 73, so he doesn't get to complete the mission of this school, but he's already created Sherborne and Coombe Springs and these other Fourth Way schools. So he has done this, and he has this interruption in doing it from about 1962 to 1970. And 1970, he decides, you know what, I'm going to do what I'm meant to do, and I'm going to create these communities. And he dies shortly after that. So here's what he has to say. Progress in self-perfecting is not automatic. It requires the use of the right methods and the determination to persevere against all discouragement. Very few people can achieve it alone. For this reason, schools of wisdom have existed from time immemorial to provide instruction and to create environments in which all can contribute to a common aim. Although such schools have always been present, they are little in evidence except in times of crisis and change, when they extend their activities to enable more people to prepare themselves for the task ahead. We're now in such a period. More and more people are looking for methods and guidance to help them with their own problems. They wish to be of service, but can only see too plainly that things have gone wrong for the lack of know-how, and are afraid of doing harm where they mean to do good. You can see the depth of Bennett's thinking. Sensible people are acutely aware that something has gone wrong with humanity. Sound familiar? It's 40 years later, it's the same story. Our present society, based on great institutions and control, economic resources, and political power, tends to strengthen the materialistic and egotistical sides of human nature. We need a new kind of society in which concern for needs of others, of nature as a whole, will predominate over self-interest and fear. One obvious need for such a society is to change our eating habits so the whole world can be kept from starvation. We need to be more self-sufficient and less dependent on vast inhuman organizations. All agree that the world is facing a food crisis, though few admit its true gravity, the artificial stimulation of agriculture by mechanization and synthetic fertilizers. He was very interested in two things: agriculture and education. So these are the kind of the basis from which he's doing the society. But here he is really pointing out the food aspect long before we get to these, absurd situation in 2022. And he's not somebody who's saying, oh, we need to stop eating meat in order to perfect ourselves. He's saying that the problem is the way that we're doing agriculture. So let's go a little further with this realization. There's another scarcely noticed effect. Work on the land has lost its charm and become intolerably dull. There is, in developed and undeveloped countries alike, a flight from the land that cannot be reversed unless life on the land is made exciting and rewarding as it was in ancient times. Boy, that's really true. It's useless to call for more effort to produce food and deny the producers a worthwhile life. It's typical of great institutions to ignore the human factor. Unfortunately, even in small societies, concern for the general welfare is paid lip service rather than readiness to make the sacrifices that are needed. Unfortunately, concern for others can be translated into effective action only by those who are working on their own self-perfecting. And here he calls for a new kind of society, which they believe can be created from small beginnings. Now, remember this, that Bennett comes out of the Fourth Way tradition. He's worked for 2 decades with Ouspensky. He worked for years with Gurdjieff, and then he works teaching their stuff for another couple of decades. And this is somebody who has quite a distinguished background. He's involved in oil geology companies. He's involved, they want him to run for office in the UK. And so he's got quite an interesting portfolio back there. And what is he doing to create out of the mystery traditions? He's creating a structure of self-sufficiency with a small group. Now, this is very interesting because directly out of the Gurdjieff work is this idea that there's going to be societal collapse and it's going to be small groups, and I'm talking 100 people together or less, that are going to be this major sustaining factor. And the idea that they get the know-how back and get out of this big centralized system. Now, that's not an easy thing to do, of course, but it's right in the heart of the fourth way tradition coming out of the mystery school tradition. They're spreading these seeds, and in little places they're coming up. Oregon, West Virginia, and of course all across the globe. I mean, Findhorn is another one, using the Steiner methods to create this incredible garden in Scotland. But there's an intense focus by the mystery schools on agriculture. And when we get into this idea that they are seeing earth changes and earth destruction in the future, earthquakes, pole shifts, and things of this nature, food would be absolutely crucial in relation to this. So it's again linking up of that kind of activity on the ground and their stance scientifically and politically with that deeper esoteric information. Now let's take that whole piece a little bit further.
Okay, for a second.
Yes.
What was the Bennett book you were just reading from?
That's a call to action from the Claymont Society. But if you get Bennett's book, Witness, then it'll have a reference to all of his speeches and papers.
Great.
And Bennett is, I think, interesting because, Ouspensky dies in 47, Gurdjieff dies in 49. And so we at least get Bennett till the end of 75. So he, as part of that fourth way tradition, he's plugged in and he's a direct lineage from the original work. So we get it's a slightly more updated sensibility wise. And I also think that he had a great way of translating ideas. And he did a lot on his own. He wasn't just taking, what Gurdjieff and Ouspensky said. He was working with other esoteric leaders and really trying to develop something new. But I think that there's a key in all this, and I'm going to show you how it connects with the pole shift part and the whole sixth root race. This thing about a new epoch coming and what's happening in relation to it is directly related to this idea that the pole shift is part of that. And so whether it happens in our generation or it happens, later on down the line, it is something which is in humanity's future and has been dealt with in times past. And it may be what's driving so much of the psychotic activity on the top layer. These people thinking, we'll be the gods who survive these terrible catastrophes, and we'll leave all the kind of proletariat out, right? The proletariat X series. They're just saying to themselves, how on earth is that guy doing this? How does he know our plans? All right. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 135. We're going deep tonight on the pole shift, the sixth root race, and the new epoch types net. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program, and we're already an hour in, and I have so much to do. This is striking. Thank God we have Olivia here running the show. But yeah, feel free to ask your questions now. She's taking care of it. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia.
Would you like a question?
Sure.
Okay, so let me find this. Lucy Rain says, Steiner said that this time it won't be a specific area that will survive the end of this epoch, but small numbers from every nation by, quote, a mechanism that can't be discussed now. What does he mean?
I love it when Steiner does that. I don't know what he means. But if it can't be discussed, then he didn't discuss it, which means we don't know what he's talking about. But he had deep levels of knowledge, and he realized, he got a lot out that the schools didn't want him to get out. I can put that across. And the Ahrimanic aspect and the A-sphere aspect was certainly a big piece of that. We owe a lot to Steiner, and he's an extraordinary figure just for, he's prolific, and the areas that he got himself into, of course, creating anthroposophy as a public mystery school, biodynamic farming, eurythmy, Waldorf schools. I mean, just a real Renaissance person. He lived up to the title. And that is his sculpture, of course, of Ahriman, which is the force that we're up against in the 21st century via the technology. Okay, so we've all heard of the spiders from Mars, right?
Mm-hmm.
How about Steiner's spiders? You want to hear about this?
Are they from Mars?
They're not. Those are Ziggy's spiders. They're from Mars. These spiders are part of a vision that he has when he looks out on the 21st century. Listen to this and then think about some of the technological aspects. Quote, this is Steiner speaking, all the beings presently conceived so incorrectly in people's thoughts, incorrectly because the mere shadowy intellect can only conceive of the mineral, the crudely material element. These thoughts of human beings that have no reality all of a sudden will become realities when the moon and the earth unite again. So he says, looking forward from the earth, there will spring forth a horrible brood of beings. And I think a lot, I'm putting myself in the mind of the transhumanists messing around with the human genome. There will be beings resembling automatons. There's a word that Cayce used about what the Atlanteans did. And they'd have an overabundance of intellect of great intensity. Along with this development, which will spread over the earth, the latter will be covered as if by a network or web of ghastly spiders possessing tremendous wisdom.
Whoa.
Yet their organization will not even reach up to the level of the plants. Whatever these things are, they are a concoction by humanity. They will be horrible spiders who will be entangled with one another. In their outward movements, they will imitate everything human beings have thought up with their shadowy intellect, which did not allow itself to be stimulated by what is to come through new imagination, through spiritual science in general. This sounds an awful lot like groups of AI entangling communications and, think about the amount of things they're learning about humanity through our interactions in social media and all the rest of it. They're studying us. And at some point here, he's saying they develop into this spider web network. All these unreal thoughts people are thinking will be endowed with being as it is covered. In other words, the virtual reality thing becomes real. As it is covered with layers of air today, or occasionally with swarms of locusts, the earth will be covered with hideous mineral plant-like spiders that intertwine with one another most cleverly, but in a frighteningly evil manner, to the extent that human beings have not enlivened their shadowy intellectual concepts. They will have to unite their being, not with the entities who are seeking to descend since the last third of the 19th century, but instead, which are these spiritual forces, but instead with these ghastly mineral-like spidery creatures. They'll have to dwell together with these spiders. They will have to seek their further progress in cosmic evolution in the evolutionary stream that this spider brood will then assume. So this is, we can see this kind of invasion of the technology around humanity. And here's Steiner using spiders as a description for what these things are. This is definitely a description around the artificial intelligence and the types of technology that is being developed without much public oversight, by the way. But I find this so compelling in the era that we're in. Steiner's looking out there. Again, there's a predictive quality and a warning attached to something that's going on in relation to humanity as they look down the road. Gurdjieff, look down the road, societal collapse. Cayce seeing these earth changers. Steiner saying, I'm seeing these spider things. What is this about? Entangling human earth existence. Okay, a little more from this. Today, we must no longer recoil from descriptions such as these. For descriptions of this kind are behind what is said to this day by many people who, based on ancient traditions, still have some awareness of things like this, and who would like to surround these ancient traditions with a certain veil of secrecy. The evolution of earthly humanity is not such that it can be veiled in secrecy any longer. This is interesting. He's saying, look, the mystery schools, there are groups of mystery schools that know this. And they they have all this imagery and all the steganography around it, but humanity never gets access to it because they can't read it. So he's saying, I'm putting it out like, we already have World War One going on. Like I'm getting this stuff out, and mystery schools that are holding it back be damned. However great the resistance in hostile quarters, these things must be said. For as I have stated again and again, the acceptance or rejection of spiritual scientific knowledge is a serious matter facing mankind. Maybe this is what we're looking at. Maybe we need this information now in the 21st century to come forward. I have stated again and again that the acceptance or rejection of spiritual scientific knowledge is a serious matter facing mankind. It is not something that can be decided on the basis of more or less indifferent sympathies or antipathies. We are dealing with something that definitely affects the whole configuration of the cosmos. We're dealing with the question of whether humanity at the present time will resolve to grow gradually into what benevolent spirits wishing to allies themselves with human beings bring down from the universe, or whether mankind will seek its continued cosmic existence in the gradual entanglement of spider brood, in the spider brood of its own merely shadowy thoughts. It does suffice today to set down the abstract formulas, the need for spiritual scientific knowledge. It's necessary to show how thoughts become realities. This is what is so dreadful about all abstract theosophists who appear on the scene and place abstractions before people. So he's saying thoughts will become realities. Thoughts are things. But he's saying that, we're dealing with what humanity is going to be able to develop, and it's going to interfere with their larger spiritual destiny. So here we have ourselves sitting in the middle of groups of people who are trying to, mess with the genome and mess with the idea of brain implants and all the rest of it. This is the stuff that they're pointing out 100 years ago needs to be stopped. And so we have that information that's been kind of vouchsafed there. And enough people have common sense anyway to say, well, certain types of cloning is completely unethical. And there's a whole Frankenstein quality around so much of this. Now, the spider aspect to me and the web aspect are, again, he's giving us that indication that what happens with the technology at a certain point is it's too invasive and it actually throws off the development of humanity. So again, it's these types of things that are maybe a little bit different than an earth changes type disaster, but it's a kind of societal disaster where the society sinks to manipulating its own citizens through technology and through biometrics, which they're so fond of pushing right now, which we've seen so much of that, the human being becoming a cyborg, the transhumanist movement of removing natural, birth parents and, the idea of replacing that. They just passed these laws in California. I was just reading about this. And, Gavin Newsom, of course, is the raging psycho there. I've pointed him out before when he was threatening martial law during the COVID op. But this guy is actually very dangerous. One of the things he created was the sanctuary rule, where if somebody wanted to come, if a child wanted to go to California to get, gender assignment surgery and this type of stuff, that they would do it and defend the child against the parents. I mean, just incredibly insane types of rulings and laws and things that they're passing there. And there's this incredible targeting of the youth coming up in their gender. And this gets us into so much of this root race, new epoch types and this thing that's coming through, and how we need to look at this, because it looks to me with the things that they're doing that they're trying to interfere with this new group that would be coming in, the new humanity, where humanity would be growing into, and to interfere with that whole process, because apparently that new group that would come in is highly telepathic. They have a natural connection to their psychic centers, and this probably gives them the ability to figure out who's who one, but also interfere with, this person has it and we don't want them to have it, kind of thing. So it goes really deep. I think it goes a lot deeper than just, they're kind of creating an entire, there's a whole medical wing aspect to this, which is they can create an entire, medical cottage industry around this whole new thing that they can do. And, but the getting between the parents and the children and the kind of just psychotic drive around this from people like Newsom, and Trudeau is also a piece of this. But those types of activities go hand in hand with the things that we're looking at here, that we're being warned about here. And so I think when we start to think about the sixth root race, this idea left behind by the mystery school, there's another group coming in that's sort of naturally connected on the spiritual side, then it gets to be very interesting to look at the interference that we're looking at and going, why would they even do that? I mean, wouldn't they want to win the parents over or something? I mean, would you really set yourself up against these parents, and just decide you're going to do whatever the hell you want to do with other people's children? Well, I think, we're looking at these types of positions in society. And so when you look at that from somebody like Newsom, what's to gain from a rule like that? So he's playing somebody else's game. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep here tonight on the pole shift of all things, and the sixth root race, or what I think we could look at as net, really, this new epoch types that are coming through. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of this. And next, I'm going to go here. We're going to get a piece of this axis idea of the pole shift through the Cayce readings. And I'm going to read how it relates to the Egyptian period, when the Egyptians took over from the Atlanteans, and how this was the last major time we experienced one of these. And then I'm going to go into when we might expect and how we would expect to deal with something like an actual pole shift in this era. And is this going to be kind of, is it the earth changes aspect that's going to encourage us to finally unplug from this central authority and build a series, a network of independent communities? So we're doing really well with that. I know I'm running over for time, but Miss Olivia, what's going on?
I got some great stuff.
Okay.
First off, Najat Madri, if they're trying to find the people of the sixth root race, could that be why they were using the PCR and 23andMe tests?
Oh, well, yes, it would be my immediate reaction to that. There's always been something strange about that. And the fact that law enforcement was able to get their hands on it so quickly, and that the whole rules around the privacy collapsed so rapidly. I remember last week watching this speech by Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, and he was saying, we're pushing for our own central bank digital currency here in America. And they're pushing for it all over the world. Or India's going to do this. And, once we get the central bank digital currency, that's, so many people from all different walks of life have just explained to me that's the end of freedom as we know it. And I want to communicate that to everyone here, that the central bank digital currency is just something that can't be allowed. And it can't be something that we participate in or use because we would be using it at our own demise. And, there's already a lot of confusion in relation to cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and things like that. They've let us develop these things independently, and they've, promoted them on the side. But when they roll in that CBDC, they probably won't. They've already talked about cracking down on things like Bitcoin and all the rest. So we're being lured into a system. And unfortunately, so many people who have studied the economic thing jumped on board with the Bitcoin thing because they hated the fiat currency system so much, and deservedly so. However, the idea that, what Powell said is that, it's not going to be anonymous, which means they're going to be able to look at and control what you have going in, what you have coming out, to such a point that there won't be any privacy left at all. And this is what they desire. So if you are somebody who is a dissident, and if you are somebody who does not go along with what a very small group at the top want to put down, then they can shut off your money. They can make things difficult for you. They're already doing it with wide swaths of the independent media. We know this for a fact. And that's just kind of a sample group for them. They would do it just like when they started to put together this whole thing in the Biden administration for the moms who were objecting to the children wearing masks at school. And Biden is like, put them on terror watch. They have this whole list of moms who showed up at soccer meetings saying, I'm not going to put up with this. So, we have to know the era that we're in. And this particular administration is particularly weak. And so they're inclined to use emergency powers and things that keep them in a powerful stance. So part of the thing with the Trump raid and all the rest of it, which regardless of what stripe you are politically, is something that you can admit has never happened in history before, where they go after a president. This type of mentality exists inside this administration. As we all know, the leader of the administration, quote unquote, Stepford Biden, is not all there. So somebody else is behind the scenes running it. And I'll tell you, after Kamala Harris's comments about America's great partnership with the Republic of North Korea, this is somebody who's a gaffe machine and just laughable on the world stage. So neither the president nor the vice president can handle the situation. So who's running the show? That's the question. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X series 135. I want to remind you before we go any further to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for a newsletter. If you're new, you definitely need this also, because it lets you know what exciting shows that we have coming up for you here, and also the incredible, interviews and documentaries that are coming up for October. Some of the shows are off the charts and almost as good as this one. So make sure that you're there and stand up and be counted, and make sure that you're part of that newsletter. It's a free newsletter. You just get it once a week, and there's not a lot of marketing involved with it, but make sure that you're there and, get behind your team that's on the ground. I know a lot of people are like, oh, I'm not sure about the world or whatever. This is the time to double down. And I had this conversation about somebody in relation to the Children's Health Defense group that RFK is running, that we really need, the kind of support for the team on the ground that's fighting the good fight for the things that we know. And so, as Fitz likes to say, former Secretary Fitz, that's our army. And so we need to support our troops. So let's keep that in mind as we go. There's a lot of fantastic people right now on the independent side really pushing on this. And, we try to have as many of them on the show as possible. All right. I promised you something about Cayce and the pole shift and the pyramids. You're going to get all three. Here we go. Unless I hear anything over there.
There's such good questions and comments about the spiders, but we'll save it.
Oh, good. Okay. We'll do a whole spiders from Mars section. All right. This reading is from 1932. And they're asking questions about the pyramids, which are fascinating enough, but these other things come out. Here we go. So Cayce's talking. Much has been written respecting that represented in the Great Pyramid. For the record, that may be read by those who would seek to know more concerning the relationships that have existed, that may exist and do exist, between those of the creative forces that are manifest in the material world. As indicated, there were periods when a much closer relationship existed, i.e., we were more spiritual. Or rather, should it be said, there was a much better understanding of the relationship that exists between the creature and the creator. Fascinating. In those conditions that are signified in the way through the pyramid as of periods through which the world has passed and is passing, as related to the religious or spiritual experiences of man, the period of the present is represented by the low passage or depression, showing a downward tendency, as indicated by the variations in the character of the stone used. This might be termed in the present as the Cruciterian age, or that in which preparations are being made for the beginning of a new subrace, or a change which, as indicated from the astronomical or numerical conditions, dates from the latter portion and the middle portion of the present fall, 1932. Remember, we're in 2022, 90 years later. In October, there will be a period in which the benevolent influences of Jupiter and Uranus will be stronger, which from an astrological viewpoint will bring a greater interest in occult or mystical influences. I heard from someone astrologically that Jupiter and Uranus were in a very powerful setup right now. This might be a kind of a redo of what happened in 32. At the correct time, accurate imaginary lines can be drawn from the opening of the Great Pyramid to the second star in the Great Dipper called Polaris, or the North Star. This indicates it is the system towards which the soul takes its flight after having completed its sojourn through the solar system. In October, there will be seen the first variation in the position of the polar star in relation to the lines from the Great Pyramid. Change. There will be the beginning of the change in the races. This will come with an influx of souls from the Atlantean, Lemurian, or Da situations. I will explain that one. These conditions are indicated in this turn in the journey through the pyramid. How has this begun? Who was given that this should be a record of man's experience in this root race? For that is the period covered by the prophecies in the pyramid. This was given by Rata and Hermes in that period during the reign of Arat, when there were many who sought to bring man a better understanding of the close relationship between the creative forces between man and his maker. So he's going into the Rata period when, with Hermes, Rata and Hermes created the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx and hid the Atlantean Hall of Records beneath the Sphinx. Only those who have been called may truly understand. Who has been called? Whoever makes of themselves a channel, who having the whole measure full would desire more, does so to his own doing. It's kind of interesting. Here's the question. What is the correct interpretations of the indications in the Great Pyramid regarding the time when the present depression will end? Remember, the economy has crashed. They're in a Great Depression, and they want to know what's going on. And he says the changes as indicated in outline are for the latter part of the present year, 1932, as far as the depression is concerned. And he goes on to describe how, there was a super materialism wave that drove this. But he gives some predictions about conditions getting better. And then they say, what was the date of the actual beginning and ending of the construction of the Great Pyramid? Was 100 years in construction, begun and completed in the period of Ararat's time with Hermes and Rata. What was the date BC of that period? 10,490 to 10,390, before the prince entered into Egypt. That's Jesus, the Prince of Peace. So he's giving it that 10,500 BC window, but he's also taking it's 100 years in construction. What definite details are indicated as to what will happen after we enter the period of the king's chamber? And he says, all do rejoice when we enter that understanding of being in the king's presence. And he goes on. There's more to that one, but I'm going to skip ahead. And then he says part of this is the empty sarcophagus indicates that the interpretation of death will be made plain. People will understand life after death. Question. If the Armageddon is foretold in the Great Pyramid, please give a description of it and the date of its beginning and ending. And he answers, not in what is left there. It will be 1,000 years with the fighting in the air as has been between those returning to and those leaving the earth. This is interesting because Armageddon is translated as war in the heavens or war in the air. And this idea that there would be higher groups coming in, like the root race, that would uplift the society, and they're being prevented from entering. And then they say, what is the date as recorded by the pyramid of entering into the king's chamber? And he says 38 to 58. That's when the end of that period in the 60s, they get very involved and fascinated with the question of life after death and psychic powers and all that. That's supposedly foretold in here. And then finally, how is this particular Great Pyramid of Giza built? by the use of those forces in nature as to make for iron to swim, while stone floats in the air in the same manner. This is an anti-gravity key that he's giving. This will be discovered in 1958. In fact, Thomas Townsend Brown's work brought a lot of this forward. And he talks a little bit about the things here. I want to bring this in, and then he mentions something that gets us again into that pole shift idea. Here's the end of it. In those periods when the first change had come to the position of the land, Atlantis, there had been an egress of peoples, or in caps now, things. Remember this. This is what the Atlanteans had created. And so these kind of cyborgs that come with them into Egypt, he's indicating something here, that they created something and they call them things. And we see this come up over and over again in the Cayce readings. From the Atlantean land, when the Nile emptied into what is now the Atlantic Ocean on the Congo end of the country, they found out later, by the way, through satellite technology, that this was true, that at one point the Nile emptied directly into the Atlantic Ocean. What is now the Sahara was a fertile land, a city that was built on the edge of the land, a city that worshipped the sun, for the use of its rays were used for supplying for the elements for which is required in the present to be grown through a season. The beginnings of those mounds and the interpretation of the crustating of the land. And then he mentions something very unusual about how this had taken place in relation to coming after the pole shift, that they created the pyramids. Now, there's one other piece here. They say, well, how do we get to the Hall of Records that Rata left and all the rest, based on the Atlantean records that would tell us all about the history? And he said, well, those records are still to be uncovered. There's a chamber passage on the right forepaw to this interest of the record chamber, or record tomb. This may not be entered without an understanding. For those that were left as guards may not be passed until after a period of their regeneration in the mount. All right, so that's getting very esoteric. And the fifth root race begins. Now, remember, Theosophy is looking at it and saying the sixth root race is going to begin. The Cayce work is calling it the fifth. They're both looking at the same dynamics. For some reason, they're using, one group is using the fifth, that we're moving into the fifth, and the other is moving into the sixth. But they're both the same root, it's the same root race. They're just using a different term. And that is fascinating that they are using a different term. But I find it very interesting that he's saying, well, the records will be found when you move into that fifth root race. In the building of the pyramid, and that what is called the mystery of mysteries, the Sphinx, this was intended to be a memorial, as would be termed today, to that counselor who ruled or governed. With the return of the priest, Rata, and they go into how all that happened. But anyway, so here's what we get from this reading. One, we're getting these answers that suggest the fifth root race begins. The new root race begins. What Theosophy called sixth, Cayce is calling fifth. That root race begins based on the knowledge of the Hall of Records coming forward and the regeneration in the mount of those that were left as sentinels. So obviously, there's a cosmological kind of etheric explanation for what he's talking about in reading this. But he's giving it to us as best as we can get it. This piece has such a link, especially since Cayce was Rata, with the period that we're in. Because here's Cayce coming back, just as he did in Egypt. He hid the records. He preserved things when Atlantis was going down. Here he is coming forward, so many lifetimes later, and giving us what? That interpretation from the mystery schools, again, about you're coming into a destruction period and you need to know what to do to vouchsafe humanity. So what we're pulling from that and what he's giving us is this fifth root race is another, it's that kind of spiritual awakening piece. And so what I'm getting from all this is that so much around that root race and, those new epoch types, that thing is why we're seeing so many skirmishes around, cloning and that whole piece around transhumanism, because they need to control that moment or the whole thing slips out of their hands. That's what I'm reading when I'm looking at this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep here tonight on the pole shift and the root race. These things go together, interestingly enough. We're going to be taking your questions in a very short period of time. Miss Olivia, before I go any further, you're up.
Maury. I have heard that the sixth root race has never before embodied. It would make sense that they would have gender, quote, issues since they are androgynes. In other words, balanced in masculine and feminine energies, they would be very vulnerable to, quote, suggestion.
Well, they don't have to be androgynes, the sixth root race, or what Cayce's calling the fifth root race, the next root race. So that piece, you know, the merging of two sexes in one comes from the Atlantean root race. That was before Emilius. Emilius comes and he separates the races into male and female. That's how the whole progress works. That's how we become individualized. And it is fascinating because so much of that piece around the androgyne and the tree of life and all the rest of it, you know, in that tree of life, the way that they're doing things on the technological side and those who want to participate in this kind of merging with machines, they realize that in certain tree of life depictions that they can move from animal life to mineral life. And the mineral life to them is to merge on the machine side. And so they're considering this and saying, I don't need to progress spiritually in order to evolve. I can do this literally by the book. And I can move one step at a time by projecting my consciousness into a being, into a cyborg. Now, the piece about the top and the bottom of the tree of life is an androgyne. It speaks to that universality. And, you know, but the root race that's coming in is certainly male and female. We're not at a point where those pieces merge. And on the understanding level, you know, if anything, it seems like women take a larger role in society as in relation to the next future wave of things, which had happened before. And remember, it's interesting, if you look at Steiner's work, he talks about how the epochs are kind of rerun, you know, so that the third epoch looks an awful lot like the sixth epoch. And so these things have cycles where they run and we open up to it. But if we look at the story of Emilius and the followers of Emilius, that whole piece in the Cayce work is all about how he was the one who came in and separated them into male and female. So that is a very kind of key piece, because it's after a time that the Belial group inside Atlantis becomes jealous of the Emilius group because they are perfected. And what they want to do is they want to use the exact same techniques that Emilius has, but they want to use it, you know, they want to use the two-eye crystal and things of this nature. If you really go into the story on the Cayce side about ancient Atlantis, that's where you're going to find that they use it for conquering, you know, that they use the two-eye stone to dominate their neighbors, basically. So it's a very different type that is there with the Belial group. And if you look around in the period that we're in, you're seeing a lot of Belial types and the Emilius types are kind of, you know, in the same type of position. In that battle, because, you know, on the surface, the Belial group wins but then they blow themselves up in essence. You know, they take the island down with them. So it's a kind of a psychotic victory. So, you know, we're definitely looking at a rerun of some of that, unfortunately, I would say. Yes.
DJ, wouldn't the sixth root race be hidden as a seed in the apparently normal people of the sixth Aryan subrace, which is also not yet in full manifestation? Wouldn't the evil be after the seeds?
Yeah, this is interesting. And again, Aryan stuff comes up in relation to how they were referred to in theosophy. It has nothing to do with being like the super race or anything like that. That's a lot of the thing that got run away with. But there are groups that are described both in theosophy and anthroposophy and in the Cayce work that are like lead up groups to the next epoch. And those groups are, they're like an advancement from where we were, but it's not quite to the next group. And I would think that they would look, I'll tell you this in relation to the political leaders around the world. They are very aware, like Elon Musk type people. They're very, very aware of all the mystery school traditions. They understand the piece about the root races. They understand the bit about the new epoch. They understand about Atlantis. And so that information is vouchsafed for them. Unfortunately, it's usually by left-hand groups. And so, it's used in a fashion for advantage. When we're looking at it and we're looking at how, it's like the question that Najat asked earlier, are they using things like 23andMe to try to identify who these people are? I absolutely think that they're using a variety of techniques to do that. And I think all of the intense, hyper control activities through the pharmaceutical environments and through the incredible push and the different ops that we've seen in relation to this, which actually want to bring society, and brought society to a complete standstill. Somebody's getting and doing a hell of a lot of data mining in that process. So then we have to ask ourselves, what is the data mining about? What is the process that they're getting? What are the details that they're getting? And that very much, I think, answers a few questions for us. Before I
can I add something?
Yeah.
Just a little commentary.
Sure.
Like, oh man, the ideas room is loaded with knowledge, right?
Yes.
People who really know their stuff and they're coming at it from different angles. And I just wanted to say one thing I really love about Jesus and his teachings is just how basic and simple it is. And that you can be someone really ignorant about mystery schools and mystery school occult knowledge or anything. And it's just very, in order to evolve, all you need to do is operate from a place of service, of love, do the best you can. In the modern days, pay your bills, be productive citizen,
like it.
Be kind, be forgiving, all of that kind of stuff. And I just wanted to insert that because, there are all these kind of lively debates about this and that. It's all very complex and, and opinionated. And really when it comes down to it, how highly functioning are you in just the basic things that you need to be doing if you wanted to be? I actually tweeted this out earlier this week about being a mensch, right? Is that the best thing you can do is be a mensch, right? And that is...
Should I tell my story about the unstable disclosure person?
Sure.
Because it's an interesting dovetail. I agree with you. All of these schools and things and all the spiritual concepts and the great teachers like Cayce and other people, they always talk about you just being, good, just being responsible. And there's a great opening with that. The Gurdjieff work is literally based on how good of a worker are you? How much can you actually work? And they mean that in straight up terms, labor strengthens. And, so I got a series of very interesting, it was from a person who was getting sucked into the whole good Wilcock train. But at a certain point, the letters they were writing me, I was looking at it and saying, I have to respond in some fashion. But they were talking about how they were in their mid-30s. They didn't really have much of a life plan. The whole thing was that disclosure was so important to them that nothing else mattered, and that all they had to do was get to disclosure, and they weren't going to hold some dumb job because they were going to get to disclosure and all the rest of it. And all I could think to myself is basically the reason that their lives had come to nothing in your mid-30s, and you can turn everything around in your mid-30s. You've got time. So it's not the last word for anybody who gets into a situation like that. As a matter of fact, sometimes that realization just drops like that and people are right back on track. But in this case, I had to go through some communication on this. And what I felt about it when I was getting this was that the person who was obsessed with disclosure, disclosure of UFO stuff isn't going to change who you are. It might be an interesting adjunct to the times that you live in, and it might open up a lot of people. But obviously, someone who's already interested in it, if the government decides that it's real, that doesn't really have much of an impact on you. Or your spiritual development, or your development or growth as a person, or how good of a friend you are, or anything like that. So my advice literally is always get your own life together first, be there, be useful, be valuable for somebody else. And don't worry about disclosure and things that are going on in the background, or mystery schools or anything else. That stuff comes around and it'll be there when you need it. But what's important is that your own act is together. I 100% agree with that.
And the idea that the teacher will appear when the student is ready, right? Yeah. So get your stuff together, right? Be ready, prepare the way, right? For your master to appear.
That's good advice.
There are plenty of activists, as we know, of all types, who want to create a better world, who are total assholes. That's just, whether you're a peace activist or whatever activist you call yourself, are you a good human being? No matter, you may have visions that you're doing some good in the world, but
That's true.
Does anybody really want to be with you? Are you an evolved soul?
It reminds me.
You're a horrible person.
Yes.
So I don't care about whatever vision, how you justify the actions that you do. Right? You're going to have to answer for all of them.
Well, it's pretty interesting because I read a series of interviews that John Lennon had, and he was talking about Jerry Rubin, and I was thinking about all these people who seem to be like peace activists and stuff in the early 70s and anti-Vietnam and all this kind of thing. We could use some of them now, but this is pretty interesting because one of the things that they did with Lennon is they tried to manipulate him into being the front man for what they were doing. And he realized that he was being used, basically. And later, originally he really pumped these guys up, and they wanted him to go to Miami Republican convention and start like a new government and all this stuff. Really putting him out there for what they wanted. And so Jerry Rubin was one of the guys that he pointed out. And he said, what I realized later was that he was a drug addict, freak, and a pig. And if you look at Rubin later, he becomes a real shark, like venture capitalists.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we have to always remember the people who are milking these positions, just like the people now who are saying, I'm woke and you're racist and all that. It's the it is that kind of moralizing and grandstanding, which shows you everything you need to know about the character, the types of people. And I would say side by side with that, a bunch of people we never get to see are incredible, true activists, real activists, people who really care. And, I run across them all the time in the work that I do. I'm just pointing out these examples because it is very important for us to know, there's a lot of snowballing that goes on out there in relation to this. So we got to be real about it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep tonight on the pole shift, the 6th root race. What did the mystery schools leave back there? It looks like they left something for us for the 21st century, and here we are picking up on it. We're going to be taking your questions very shortly. We've been trying to keep up with them here and there. All right, this is interesting. This is a Steiner piece and also gets us into the whole future thing. What's going on in the future here? And this is a little different from the spider part. This theme is false prophets. I find this interesting. Let's take a little bit of Steiner here. Spiritual research today shows us that after Kali Yuga has run its course, which lasted 5,000 years, approximately 3100 BC to 1900, new capacities will appear in the isolated few who are specially fitted to receive them. A time will come when individuals will be able, through the natural development of the new clairvoyance, to perceive something of what is announced only by spiritual science or spiritual research. We're told that in the course of the next centuries, increasing numbers of people will be found in whom the organs of the etheric body are so developed that they will attain to clairvoyance. So he's seeing out there, these people are coming in who are more psychically attuned. That's us. And this is probably why there's so much interference going on. So, this type of clairvoyance, which today can only be acquired through training, how are we to account for this? What will be the nature of the etheric body in these few who develop clairvoyance? There will be some who will receive clairvoyant impressions, and I should like to describe to you a typical example. A man performs some act and at the same time feels himself impelled to observe something. A sort of dream vision arises in him, which at first he does not understand. But if he's heard of karma or how world events conform to law, he'll then realize little by little that what he has seen in the karmic is the karmic counterpart of his present deeds made visible in the etheric world. Thus, with the first elements of the future capacities become gradually developed. Those who are open to the stimulus of spiritual science, middle of the 12th century on, is a renewal of what St. Paul says is a mystery to come. And he goes into great detail about how in the Middle Ages, somewhere around the Renaissance, things changed dramatically and our senses opened. So he says, mankind is gradually growing into that world in order to be able to perceive from the physical plane that which formerly could only be perceived in the mystery schools from the perspective of higher planes. Nevertheless, occult training is still necessary. It always presents things in a different light to those who have not undergone occult training. But occult training will, by the transformation of the physical body, show the mystery of Golgotha in a new way. And then he goes off about, how this type of training opens things up. But I think what I'm getting here is, again, he's saying that this stuff used to be that you had to be in a mystery school to develop it. But here we are, coming into the 21st century, and this root race that's coming in is going to have these abilities naturally. And therefore, there are opportunities for spiritual advancement, and they're going to be more in tune with the spiritual side. So the idea of cutting people off from the natural spiritual roots suddenly makes a lot more sense, because if people are coming in connected to that, then, they're not going to be very willing slaves on a hamster wheel for massive controllers behind the scenes. So finally, he says, what I've just said is the truth, which has long been communicated to a select few from within the esoteric schools. And it's a truth that today must pervade the teachings of spiritual science in particular, because spiritual science is intended to be a preparation for that which is to come. Mankind is now ready for freedom and self-knowledge, and it is highly probable that those who proclaim themselves to be the pioneers of the Christ vision will be denounced as fools on account of their message to mankind. It is possible for mankind to sink still deeper into materialism and to spurn that which could become a most valuable revelation for mankind. Everything that may happen in the future is to a certain extent subject to man's volition. Consequently, he may miss what is intended for his salvation. It's very important. So this information is coming out, these groups are here, and it's very easy for humanity to stumble over it and say, like, oh, what a fanatic, or, that doesn't conform with my Netflix woke training, so I'm going to shut that off. This is, these are the stakes. And I think this is what Steiner is pointing out in relation to that. I didn't want to leave this presentation without getting into and showing something in relation to our friend Morris K. Jessup. By the way, that's one of the many letters there between Einstein and Hapgood relating to the pole shift. And there were a couple of interesting articles that have been floating around there. One of them in Live Science, Earth magnetic poles could be about to flip. Experts warn that reversal could cause widespread blackouts and make parts of the world uninhabitable. And that's just the magnetic flip. And just a quick snapshot so we remember what we're talking about. Plato's description of the destruction of Atlantis. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Here we go. Appalling earthquakes and floods occurred, and in the course of a single terrible day and night, the whole fighting force of your city sank all at once beneath the earth, and the island of Atlantis likewise sank beneath the sea and vanished. Plato. He's saying it happened in a day and night. That's how sudden. And I have to say, whenever I've read about the pole shift and how sudden it is, and how, they've got that woolly mammoth eating and he's caught with the stuff in his mouth and he's frozen over, on the spot while he's still eating. I mean, that's pretty fast. So I don't know. I feel like I have that jump over anything feeling that I described earlier. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, this I'm going to save for next time. This is Jessup's quote. I found it particularly interesting because it brings in the UFO side. It's an unusual and obscure and very ahead of its time book from 1957 called UFOs and the Bible. This is interesting because Jessup, of course, would be bumped off because of his knowledge of both the UFO file and the Philadelphia experiment. And for years, they've tried to push this thing that, Jessup, he was depressed. Well, the person he was going to meet before he was found dead with carbon monoxide in his car in an abandoned park was J. Manson Valentine, who will also discover the Bimini Road some 8 years later. And there's some very interesting things that Valentine had to say, and I have them here. But anyway, he wrote the incredible works around UFOs and was really opening the subject up, had a great grasp on archaeology as well. But all the roots of the Von Daniken Chariots of the Gods piece and Ancient Aliens and all that really go back to this book, UFOs and the Bible. And I can see them kind of mining it early on because this is the 1950s. But just a little bit. This chapter is called Rescue by UFO. You ready? And he compares things in the Bible directly with what happens in UFO cases. So here is a quote. And then shall he send his angels and shall gather together his elect from the four winds and the uttermost parts of the earth to the uttermost parts of heaven. He goes, let's paraphrase it. The great shining and powerful mothership will appear among the clouds, and the master will dispatch his assistants in smaller craft and will gather from all parts of the earth those that have survived the brunt of the cataclysm and have reached temporary places of safety, and particularly those with whom the shepherd race deems suitable for the propagation and resurgence of humanity in a new racial generation, and how, remember, root race, and how these will be taken to live for a while in the celestial regions which are the homes of the UFOs in space. And he says, that is, if we are ready to accept that there is a mentor or shepherd group of entities occupying the reaches of space around the Earth-Moon system, still we can't absorb this without doing some digging. So he goes into this whole piece about what if we interpret the UFO wave. It's just, it's a point of view. It's a theory. Theoretically, he's saying, what if we observe the UFO thing from the point of view of the biblical, the angels are coming here and helping us. So this is very interesting, especially since in the 50s you had groups like, Venusian groups or Pleiadian groups who looked, like angels, basically. And but what's fascinating is throughout this book, UFOs in the Bible, there's that thread of disaster and the UFOs coming in to save the day, and a new root race starting. I found that interesting in looking at Jessup's work because Jessup was such a hardcore, he was somebody who got so much truth going on the UFO subject. His own spiritual belief he was trying to combine with what he was seeing. And I found that pretty interesting. I don't get caught up with the idea of UFOs being evil or deities. But it is interesting to look at people who were very deep on the UFO file and got bumped off. And there's a reason why they weren't there, because groups like X-Protect got rid of them. What was it that they were bringing forward that was so threatening to a group like that? And with that, Miss Olivia, I am going to turn it over to you.
Okay, let's talk about consciousness a little bit. Diana B says, could the pole shift be in accordance with a polarity reversal in consciousness? This could explain why the intense increase of harmonic forces. Andrew says, maybe pole shift is esoteric code for some big change on Earth. It will be interesting to hear about that.
Yes.
Charlie MC2 says, pole shift is when the gravitational pull against the Earth causes its shift, the axis to shift. And Christine Laurel says the Diehold Foundation has some compelling material on when the next pole shift will happen in 2046.
Oh, well, that's interesting. Whenever I hear a date, I always wonder where that's coming from. But all that's very interesting. One, on consciousness, yes, I agree with you. Two, I think that there are groups who, from that mystery tradition, who left us things like the Great Pyramid, for example, Rata, the whole mystery school, Hermes out of Atlantis. And they left the explanations in mathematics and in geometry, because they figured, well, whatever language these people will speak, we will know that they'll be advanced in math and science, and we'll speak to them like that. So they lay out the pyramid, 365 days, 365 feet, and all the rest. And they make it a gigantic calendar marker, as we see all around the world. Now, there's so many explorations around this through the work of Graham Hancock, and there's so many great people that have got into it, Bivol and all the rest, that I think a lot of people and the ideas from know their work, the archaeoastronomy. The question is, if these people knew these things, then obviously they understood the great cycles of the Earth, and they knew when the pole shift and thing was going to happen next, especially if they'd been under, like dealing with this incredible shift and had gone through it. They wanted to preserve humanity through that type of disaster and preserve the type of humanity. So when humanity reemerged, they would reemerge as humans and not have to go all the way down the evolutionary ladder again. Now, certainly we run the chance with the type of technology that we have of going all the way back to a Stone Age existence. We faced it. It's something that actually comes up in the notes that Kennedy has when he's talking about what to do in relation to Khrushchev, and there he recognizes there are people who are in the military who want to bomb them back to the Stone Age. And there are people under Khrushchev's command who, they're hot to trot to get into a shooting war as well, even though the weapons are off the charts. So humanity is vulnerable in that situation. And there's no question that there are higher beings that could foresee the period that we would come into, this period, and with the incredible communications and the gigantic shift that was taking place. So the idea that they left, vouchsafed for us, these messages through things like the pyramid and all the rest makes a heck of a lot of sense to me. And so I think that they would look out into the future and know when that pole shift was going to take place and warn us about it. So, but I think that we have to be aware enough to find it, to find what they left us. And so, on this level, it's an actual physical event. Then there's the consciousness piece, which is when the actual axis tilts, changes, different energies, different cosmology comes into play. And so you get a different beings, they're developing towards this root race, and this is the new environment. Now, in relation to this, one of the kind of major tenets of the mystery schools is land rising. And I've tried to put this across over and over again, that land rising is an absolutely crucial aspect of the things that are taking place. We hear so much about, global warming is going to climate change will take out so many cities and all the rest of it. They never talk about the land rising. So just in the last week, there was an island in the Pacific that came up out of the blue, and they were like, "Oh, a new island is born." Look, this is happening. And the idea in the mystery school traditions, I haven't even read Blavatsky's piece yet, which I'm going to. What she says is pretty plain about what's going to happen in relation to that. We're going to get land rising in the Atlantic. Cayce said the same thing. So that was the great continent of what? Atlantis. So that Atlantis piece is rising. And so we start to get our heads wrapped around this again. A quick thing, I'm going to read this quote from Blavatsky, and then I promise we'll move on that. That is Helena Blavatsky, who founded the Theosophical Society against incredible odds in 1875 and put out the remarkable tome, Isis Unveiled, and then followed up with The Secret Doctrine. Remarkable work directly from the mystery schools. And, she comes not without her own foibles, but she gets together with Henry Alcott, who's the bearded gentleman there, and they form this incredible alliance and create this incredible esoteric society and it becomes a public mystery school just in time. Okay, this is Blavatsky on the root race and all the rest. Here we go. Occult philosophy teaches that even now, under our very eyes, the new race and races are preparing to be formed, and that it is in America that the transformations will take place, and has already silently commenced. The Americans are, in short, the germs of the sixth subrace, and in some few hundred years more will become most decidedly the pioneers of that race, which much succeed the present European or fifth subrace in all its characteristics. After this, in about 25,000 years, they'll launch into preparations for the seventh subrace. The fifth will overlap the sixth for many hundreds of millenniums. This process of preparation for the sixth great race must last throughout the whole sixth and seventh subraces. Another and new dwelling, the sixth continent, will have appeared above the new waters on the face of the globe so as to receive the new stranger. To it also will emigrate and settle all those who shall be fortunate enough to escape the general disaster. Get that pole shift. As nature no more proceeds by sudden jumps and starts, the final cataclysm will be preceded by many smaller submersions and destructions, both by wave and volcanic fires. There will be no more Americans when the sixth race commences, no more, in fact, than Europeans, for they will now have become a new race and many new nations. Mankind will not grow again into giant bodies, as in the case of Lemurians and Atlanteans. They're physically 8 feet tall. Because while the evolution of the fourth race led the latter down to the very bottom of materiality in its physical development, the present race is on the ascending arc, and the sixth will be rapidly growing out of its bonds of matter and even of flesh. Thus, it is the mankind of the New World, one by far the senior of the old one, a fact men had also forgotten, whose mission in karma is to sow the seeds for a forthcoming grander and far more glorious race than of those we know at the present. Steiner would update the language of race to epoch, but I think we get the idea. And this whole net thing that I've put across, the new epoch type, that really seems to be kind of it seems right in there with what they're saying. And then just as an aside, she says something else about the root races here. Let the reader remember, this is Blavatsky now, let the reader remember well that which is said of the divisions of root races and the evolution of humanity in this work, and stated clearly and concisely in Mr. Sinnett's Esoteric Buddhism. There's that book again. There are 7 rounds in every Manvantara. This one is the 4th, and we are in the 5th root race at present. Each root race has 7 subraces. Each subrace has, in its turn, 7 ramifications, which may be called branch or family races. By the way, when they say sub, they mean the next stage that you move to. So it's all of humanity, all one group moving when they speak of race. They're not talking about splitting those races off. The little tribes, shoots, and offshoots of the last named are countless and depend on karmic action. Okay, we'll go on further from there. The human race has been compared to a tree, and this serves admirably as an illustration. The main stem of a tree may be compared to the root race, its larger limbs and various sub-races, 7 in number. On each of these limbs are 7 branches or family races. After the cactus plant is a better illustration, for its fleshy leaves are covered with sharp spines, each of which is compared to a nation or tribe of human beings. So Blavatsky leaving us that interpretation of evolutionary pattern of these groups, but she's saying clearly there's going to be not only a new race, but a new continent. And these other lands are going to be split up. So there will be dramatic earth changes, and those who will be prepared will kind of reap the benefits of moving into this new era. So there's something in this, because it seems like all the different groups refer to a classic kind of disaster scenario and then a new emerging epoch for humanity. Those groups, like I said, who made the 2012 movie, and the ones who are trying to block out the sun and do all these other things, the Gates types, they're very aware of this aspect, and they're trying, in my opinion, to control it. That's where we get so many of the bizarre activities going on. We must be right in that window that Steiner talked about in 1920. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Deep tonight on the pole shift and the 6th root race emerging net, as it were, the new epoch types. We're taking your questions now, and Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, Daniel Jorgensen, pole shift. Since it's magnetic and humans are electromagnetic creatures along with all life, I theorize that humans will have a psychic evolution, and that's what the deep state is trying to lock down. A cult fan says, is the massive use of pharma, to suppress these psychic powers in the public at large? And Jordan Banner says, so what are they looking for in the DNA? Specific signs of this 6th root race?
Well, I hate to tell you what this reminds me of, but the massive push around late-term abortions, and I don't get into the abortion subject on this program for a lot of reasons, because I think there's so many people on every side of this. But I will say this in relation to it. There's some things that these legislatures have pushed for that are absolutely inhuman along these lines. And, I've seen all kinds of different conversations around it. And I think fundamentally, there's room for a lot of different ideas and opinions around this. But I think that that big push on the right and the big push on the left and all the rest is one thing. But what I'm seeing is somewhere in the middle of that actual debate process, this other group is coming in and saying, we want certain types of material to work with. And that's where a lot of the very, very late status abortion stuff comes in. So that's what I go to when I think of the level of experimentation that they want to do. Just going into cloning, just going into the transhumanist aspect, just going into the biometric aspect of wanting to implant a brain chip. I mean, that's a real clear way to see what does this person have for the silver cord connecting their psychic self, the seed of the soul, as it were. So those are places which no government and which no scientific entity should ever be allowed to control. But it is quite fascinating in terms, again, of what these people may be looking for and the types of things they may be trying to control. This might have been more like 6 months ago, where I talked about the idea that they were not only trying to control where and when they would reincarnate, but also trying to prevent the incarnation of certain types of helpful individuals because they would be aware of them. And I found it interesting when, if you study Gurdjieff and if you study Blavatsky, there's always a little bit of like, well, they were born either in 1872 or 1877, or they were either born, in December or June. There's a lot of missed happenings. And I believe that that's not just the times that we're looking at there. I think there's a reason for certain types of esoteric teachers to keep that information private because of the absolutely powerful astrological aspects involved with this. So, yeah, it gets more and more interesting. Miss Olivia.
Okay, on that note, Sean Jackson, does DJ think people are being grown like in Blade Runner?
Yeah, there's no question. This is where that scientific process is. I've said this before in relation to the alien aspect. If one military, central intelligence officer sees an alien in some kind of, preservation fluid, and they're under an oath of secrecy to never say anything about it. On some level, all of humanity has seen it, because one of the things we learned through the Cayce work is all subconscious minds are connected, ultimately. And one time when Cayce was giving a reading, someone asked, where are you getting this information from? And he says, from the subconscious mind of the person who's asking for the information. So it's their own subconscious that is beaming it out. The same is true about this. So when it comes to cloning and things like that, and when it comes to technology, I know they're 30, 40, 50, sometimes even much more farther ahead. And therefore, the level to which they've taken the kind of Frankenstein version of their cyborg transhumanist cloning, I'm sure has reached levels like that. For sure. Yes.
Najat Madri. So could the breakaway civilization be preparing for the pole shift and to reappear to control the new race?
Yes. I think they want to suppress that whole thing. And I think they'd like to control it. And so it gets deep on that level. But certainly it seems to me that groups like the Central Intelligence Agency try to recruit actively psychics when they're young, quite young. And so, and we've seen that they've experimented on record with psychic programs like remote viewing and things of this nature. So therefore, it's no stretch to imagine the real levels of what they do. We know that they placed agents, for example, in the mid-60s inside the ARE to find out what was going on in relation to this Hall of Records thing. So, if you're willing to sort of invade the Cayce Foundation to get answers on these things, what do you think they're up to? And it's weird, but there's a lot of CIA people who attend, like UFO conferences and things like that. But I find them attending the ARE stuff and they talk about it, which I find a little bit eerie. But there's this weird kind of queer interest on the side of the CIA to be always completely on top of this psychic, metaphysical, esoteric aspect. And for me, they feel out of control if they think that something relating to the older civilization that was more awake, that was more advanced in relation to its own spirituality, they have rules based on these secret groups about that to try to maintain as much control over that as possible. So the wall of secrecy doesn't just apply to UFOs. It applies heavily to information relating to Atlantis. No question about it, including the fact that, a lot of Atlantean researchers get hassled. I remember when they were hassling Graham Hancock, and there was a group called Psychop that was funded by the CIA. And they had guys like Amazing Randy and all those people. And you would think, oh, what a bunch of jokers, who cares about them? But they would make problems for guys like J. Anthony West and Hancock when they were going to universities to give their talks and things like that. They would create phony protest groups that would call the university and get their gig canceled. and say like, oh, we don't want pseudoscience. What it is the, those types of groups and that deeper kind of thing that resides inside the intelligence groups wants to control that narrative and cannot stand when they get, good, solid, respectable researchers who can back up what they're saying in relation to an ancient past. It's dangerous for them. Yes.
Debbie McAdoo, I know DJ covered this before, but was Epstein working on his version of the sixth root race?
Well, I'll tell you, a picture says 1,000 words, doesn't it? So that's Stephen Hawking on Epstein Island. And we know that Epstein took him down in a specially suited with Maxwell submarine and took him underwater. And the name of the submarine was Atlantis. So we're dealing with somebody who used to come by, close by to here at this Harvard office that dealt with eugenics and fund them millions of dollars. So Epstein was deeply engaged with this, and some of the notes that surfaced during that trial, those trials really helped us a lot to understand what was going on. But some of the notes from the trial showed that he wanted to impregnate 99 women with his super genes, but he didn't want to do it, the way someone would normally get. But he wanted to do the test tube kind of thing. This is the twist on it. Whatever it was that they were working on and trying to enroll scientists like Marvin Minsky and people into, relates directly to that cult of Belial piece. And I'd recommend the episodes that we did dealing with Maxwell and Atlantis, because they're very eye-opening, and particularly pay attention to the Cousteau aspect of that, because whatever it was that Cousteau had discovered, they wanted a piece of that big time. Yes.
Rat Boy Genius says, Steiner said that our understanding in this life gets carried into the spirit world after death. I think the evil overlords have written off the earth and are taking over the spirit world. What say you?
Well, I haven't had any direct reports from the spirit world on this, but I will say this, that Steiner said that there was a war that took place, and this is cosmological style talk, from 1840 to 1879, in which Archangel Michael had defeated this evil force on the heavenly plane, and that force was cast down to earth, and that we are dealing with whatever it is that took place there. So the Michael imagery and the Michael archetype and the power of that, we just had Michaelmas yesterday, right? It's representative of that, like King Arthur and the dragon and Merlin, that whole piece. It's archetypal about our own struggle in this life. And so it goes up into these higher realms of what takes place in the heavenly realm. And it comes down directly to, the battles and the things that we take on in our own lives. So I think that there's a lot in the Michael story. So that would be my kind of thoughts on that. Yes.
Mind Control Incorporated. DJ, are the hybrids part of the sixth root race as a stand-in of sorts?
Well, an artificial sub. Yes. I would say that could definitely be true. By the way, that's a great name. The other thing I would say is it's fascinating to me that when you get around the alien aspect, let's think about it this way. All those stories, even the Betty and Barney Hill story, has a huge reproductive component to it. She gets a pregnancy test before they did pregnancy tests like that. He gets, all of these different things that happen to him, and checking out his sex center. And we know that Barney Hill goes down pretty quickly. He dies 6 years after the incident, which I find interesting too, because he was a relatively young guy, 46 years old. I think that when we look at the incredible emphasis in some of those alien stories by thoroughly plausible people who said apparently, they were trying to hybridize me with what was going on with them, and they showed me the child and let me hold it and all the rest of it. There's a lot of stories like that. So therefore, my conclusion on that was certainly that, there's some aspect relating to the UFO piece. So when they're talking about root races and when they're talking about the types of periods that we're moving into, I think there's a few ways that we can take the UFO presence there, but certainly they're involved and on the consciousness scale for sure. By the way, that's a shot of Einstein with our friend Oppenheimer. And again, a great deal in common, both very much involved with the atomic bomb project. And very, in the case of Oppenheimer, had a lot of qualms about developing this technology for people he didn't think were spiritually advanced enough to handle it. And that's the same position. We're kind of like the living version of Oppenheimer now. Unfortunately, in Oppenheimer, if you look at those pictures, he looked like a guy who'd really been through it. He'd been through some stuff. He'd been slugged around by this process. And, he had a lot of questions, and he had this kind of brilliant sense about him. And he was very aware of the Upanishads and ancient Indian mysteries. And he knew that as a scientist, he was working in the direction of doing something that was noble. But then he wondered immediately, am I contributing to this death machine? And, I think that we all now have a little pinch of Oppenheimer in us, because people who have a conscience and see the kind of scientific savagery really that's going on under the name of we will keep you safe, or we will make you healthy, or whatever it happens to be. A good
Who
deal.
Who trust them with any of that?
Yeah, good point. A good deal of that whole system just is completely shut off from any sense of spiritual duty. Yes.
Okay, time for the spiders. All right, Karen Carpenter. Spiders are connected with parasitic beings related to black goo, electric wires, and computers, AI, in an alternative media. Does DJ have an opinion on this, particularly Morgellons? And Christine Laurel says, yes, that sounds like Morgellons self-assembling nanotech dropping down from geoengineering.
Yeah, well, there are people who can really speak to this, like Alana Freeland and some excellent researchers that she's worked with. There's also an incredible amount of fluff around this stuff. And what I don't like is there's a little too much imagination around it too. So, there's a lot of stuff that just shows up unsupported. And it's like black goo is AI stuff. And, that's it. So I'm interested in it. And I'm interested in the really incredible research. If you read Alana Freeland's book, you have so much about geoengineering that you can apply to this mystery. That's a real good, solid way to go in. And that's somebody who has a background as a Steiner teacher too. So she's aware of both sides. That's very helpful when you're dealing with that kind of information. But I do think, just like ectoplasm was a big piece in mediumship, there's a crossover level from that dimension to this one with substance. And that's what I think so much of the CERN experiments are about. We never get to hear about that side. And, the CERN thing is so unusual. And at the same time, there's, you remember the general rules of dark journalism, which is there's the official story. In CERN's case, we're trying to smack these particles together to find the God particle. And then there's the counter story, which is called the conspiracy theory, but usually is, people like professors and writers and all the rest of it. And they come forward and they say, well, actually, in fact, CERN is one of the biggest users of the internet. And there were a series of lawsuits against them for, the possibility of them creating a black hole and things like that. And then finally, this junk conspiracy. And so they just make up some really far out thing, and there's weird stuff at CERN. I mean, I've covered it when they do mock human sacrifices and the kind of imagery around it. It doesn't really make sense. For example, very famously, the cards. These are some of the CERN tarot cards. The CERN tarot cards are quite unusual. I did a show on them, I think a year ago now, with Gigi Young. And they are just very interesting. These are things that don't add up with what their kind of major charter is. So therefore, I think we're looking at something unusual there. Now, once in a while, you'll get a real hardcore religious thing about like CERN has opened the vault to all these demons and we're all finished. I don't know. I think we have to still get information about how these things are done and apply maybe the types of information that the mystery schools have left us to try to interpret some of what these groups are doing. Because we have to be careful about junk conspiracy when we get around these things also. So when someone mentioned the black goo thing, there's an AI piece around this. And there's, like I said, almost like an ectoplasm piece that comes from interacting with the astral plane on a physical basis. And, ectoplasm, if you look at all those early mediumship things, it happened almost all the time. So there's something unusual there. And this also gets us into apotheum and some of the things that UFOs do that defy the physics that take place. So I think that those are the areas I tend to look to first when I'm doing this work. And apotheum, I think, is completely unexplored, except in dark journalism, really. But, that stuff, when they say there's missing time with UFO encounters, how does it happen? They have to be in control of and exhibiting this effect, this reality distortion effect. And that, if you go back to the Atlantis story, that's really the problem that takes place there after the fact. And I've tied that in my research into all kinds of steganography, where they take this thing that happened that almost removed the ability for any kind of advancement. And so the apotheum effects, there are weird to study on UFOs because they're so basic. Here's just a couple. Somebody says, "Oh, I'm being abducted and the alien is taking me through the wall." All right. Now, there were a lot of cases like that. And one of the things I remember about my discussions with John Mack, God bless him, when he was alive, was he talked about that. And it was confusing because, it's one thing to say an alien comes and hypnotically they have telepathic abilities. They summon people. They know how to shut off their engines and things like that. But how do you get them to go through walls? That's dematerialization. So there's a lot with that. Also, the fact that when a UFO lands somewhere, nothing can grow there. It's a completely negative, like the field, the generating field of the UFO, that it plays with time and it plays with nature. That's apotheum. And so I highly recommend, that course of thinking when it comes to this. Yes.
Jay Vandervest says Godzilla ain't looking so bad now. Love it. I want to make sure we have the.
I'm sure he's a genetic experiment of some kind. Yeah.
He's actually from Nukes, right?
Well, you're making me think of the Mothman because I'm going to admit it. I'm working on a Mothman episode for everyone. So, yes.
Okay.
Because he was the product of this. I mean, one of the weird things about the Mothman is he kept showing up around this old depot where they created these weapons, and they had incredible kind of acid rain drop off. Yes.
Okay, David Tormina. DJ, what do you make of Elizondo claiming that he was told by higher ups that UFOs are demonic?
Yeah, I mean, this is also every side of Lou, right? Anything that he can get in on is like, I'm a remote viewer, I'm a whistleblower, I work for the space for, like it's a Walter Mitty exercise. This guy, or Zelig, if you know your movies. Mm-hmm. The way I look at Elizondo, though, is he's always looking for some edge that's going to bring him and his faltering story in. And whatever it is that he was set up to do with the UFO threat thing hasn't worked out as well as he or they wanted to. And I think that they, the group that put him up forward, which is a CIA associated group that started the TTSA, what they want to do is move away from the Elizondo thing unless he can prove himself. So I think he's out there on his own branch trying to
just get traction on
become
something. He's just throwing spaghetti at the wall at this point.
Well, he's trying to become viable. Remember this, his book, he was supposed to have a book out, and the documentary on CNN. I know that Leslie Kean was doing a bio movie with HBO on him writing his bio. Okay. So it's weird. I'm not seeing that stuff. And I know that the CNN thing looks like it's canceled. So there's something weird going on there. And it seems like whoever was promoting Lou is maybe pulling the rug out and going for Gary Nolan. So that's what we're hearing. That's what we're seeing. And Nolan is actually a creepier thing than Elizondo because, you know, he's like the Fauci saluting CIA guy who is also an immunologist. And, you know,
do you have a picture of Nolan? Do you have that picture?
No,
okay.
No, I don't have it handy, but I've there's a lot of interesting things going on with the guy. And yeah, they dressed him up like me for one interview. Okay.
It was incredible. It's black suit, white tie. The tie tied a little lower, right?
Yeah, there's something weird about that. It was like they got Gary Nolan, you know, to troll me. Mm-hmm. But
it is. It's like a sign, like a signal to you.
I think so. What I want to do with those people is I want to say this, you know, we know you're out there and we know the game. So anticipate that, you know, doing the UFO threat thing or creating like a phony scientific disease that came from a UFO and threatens the world or whatever is going to go down hard, because the way that it works is you're getting caught in the early stages of the op that you're trying to pull off. And there's too many people beyond myself who are very aware of the things that these guys are trying to pull. So the UFO threat piece, and, you know, the bringing out of Nolan to replace Lou, and like Lou saying, I'm a remote viewer and all this stuff. You know, we've worked on this for 4 years of exposing TTSA, not because I dislike TTSA, but because it's my job as an investigative journalist to, you know, this is the nature of the thing, that investigative journalism is adversarial journalism, not personal, but it very clearly, you know, I've made the description before. If a CEO is dumping nuclear waste in a river, you know, the relationship between the person investigating them and the CEO is not going to be a friendly one. So that's just the way it goes, but it's always professional. And I've invited all those people onto this show for a gentleman's debate. They know that they can do that. They don't want to because they're afraid that engaging with me for 2 minutes is kind of the end of the op. And it's the end of the op for Nolan. It's the end of the op for Elizondo, who's a counterintelligence agent and has been working for the government the whole time. So he's not ex-Pentagon, which is the big lead off with all of his headlines. So the real question is, you know, with the Arrow, the new Project Blue Book 22 Redux thing, and with Kirsten Gillibrand and all these Congress people coming forward, do they have enough support? Do they think they have enough support to pull off the threat op? They want the threat op. I don't think they have enough on the threat op. And I think that what they need to do, they've decided, is they need to put forward CIA agents who are also contactees. And they've put forward 3, which is ridiculous. These guys are not, you know, contactees. I don't buy it at all. And I think it's part of this threat program. And the CIA is just not trustworthy. If you study it with any kind of academic rigor, they're an organization that lies for a living.
Yeah, I want to say also, I've known some contactees, and
oh yeah,
they, you know, there's a type, and usually they're very sensitive and empathetic people.
Oh yeah,
very honest, and you know, they're just not CIA types in any way, shape, or form. Now, whether being contacted or being experiencers made them that way, or whether they were chosen because they were that way, can be debated, right? But you know, and we've seen plenty of videos of interviews of people who've been who are experiencers and stuff, and they all seem to be cut from a similar cloth. They're very sincere people.
Yes.
They're not, they don't come up as phony or guarded or any of that.
No, I don't think they could be CIA people.
Right,
That's the
exactly.
nature of the thing. It's funny too. One of the weird things that came out was when Semivan, by the way, when I've said, you know, pointed out that Nolan's a big part of the CIA, has worked with the CIA for years. Some Nolan supporters have come up and said, you know, prove it or whatever. That's his own bio. He doesn't deny working with the CIA. He talks about it. So don't, you know, if you're a big Gary Nolan fan, I'm sorry. He's a CIA person who supports Anthony Fauci. That's just the facts. He did it in his own Twitter. He promoted Fauci. You know, he's like, Dr. Fauci, you're a great man, and all this. So that's him. It's his stuff. It's not Dark Journalist. So that's who you have the problem with. Go right to Gary Nolan. But you have to understand, see, all of the fanboy stuff around this too is part of the operation, and they create an atmosphere which, in terms of real support, you know, people who get introduced to this subject, you know, they don't know anything about Elizondo, and they don't, you know anything about Nolan. These are just people who kind of swing around in the sphere around this thing, trying to make a name for themselves based on the fact that there's a UFO threat operation. The UFO threat operation comes directly out of the Central Intelligence Agency. All those people have to be completely associated with it or actual agents. It can't work any other way. So that's why. So I want the truth about UFOs, but I don't want a dishonest CIA UFO op. I mean, I think that's fair. And, you know, from the work that we do on this program, the CIA is still withholding records from when they murdered President Kennedy. Why should I trust them about aliens? I mean, come on, you know, if you're going to withhold records for 60 years, then give me a break. So there's no truth telling in the CIA. Why on earth would the CIA give anyone the truth about UFOs? It would be stupid. They wouldn't do it. I mean, you know.
Is it the first rule of sort of spiritual evolution that you stop lying, that you tell the truth?
Oh, isn't that interesting? Yeah. That's a really good point. And you know, I was reading, there's a whole thing about lying in anthroposophy. It's too much to get into here, but I think fundamentally, here's the thing: when you get a group like that, you know, you go. There are certain types of boards in government where you can get the truth about things. You know, so you like the CBO is set up like that, and it's supposed to be an independent organization that looks into these things. The Central Intelligence Agency is loyal to itself. And it has, you know, been guilty and been hauled before the courts and the American public and the Congress, and they've gotten away with things over and over again, overthrowing leaders of other countries, you know, disrupting elections, all kinds of stuff, drug running. I mean, you name it. And so they're an entity unto themselves. So the idea of getting UFO truth and disclosure from the CIA is about as crazy as you get. So, or as uninformed as you get, I suppose. So fundamentally, yeah, you'll never get the truth from those people. You don't need government disclosure around the UFO file. You can, you know, work along the lines of Mack or Stanton Friedman, or, you know, going through the cases to find out the truth about that, especially going forward. And if anything, the government doesn't want you to study it. They just want you to be afraid of it. Yeah.
Mr. Monocle, doesn't DJ worry that he's poking the bear?
Oh, I've been doing that for a long time. No, I think what's important is, I'd be more nervous if this stuff was just going by unopposed. If anything, I'm happy to see people waking up to it. It's unfortunate that we have to deal with, the amount of sock puppets and things that guys like Elizondo create to promote themselves. And it's kind of funny to watch if you know anything about how marketing works, because there are always those little voices that it reminds me of the Pee Wee Herman movie. Do you remember the scene where he's being beat up and they said, "I think we should kill him." Yeah. And he goes, "I think I should let him go." That's really what it reminds me of, because the sock puppets always say this stuff like, it's great to have a hero on our side. And I remember seeing really good people interview GTSA people and who used to be good in the UFO field. And guys like George Knapp and stuff would sit down with Elizondo and they give him softball questions like, how does it feel to be a hero? Is it better to like a hero or a great whistleblower? Like which one, I mean, can you ask the guy a real question? How about this? Do you still work for the Central Intelligence Agency? That's all you needed to ask for legitimate journalism. We didn't get it. And we got 4 years of them sucking the oxygen out of the UFO field instead, and CIA foothold, So yeah, they rocked it, baby.
Karen Carpenter, the polls have been moving slowly. At some point, will they make a dramatic shift or flip entirely?
Yeah, well, this is the nature of the thing. I think that the warning that's left there when they talk about cataclysms coming in the future relates to an actual shift. And this is something that Hapgood was getting to in his research. And, they always try to go after Hapgood and say pseudoscience and all the rest of it. Look at the opening of his book with Einstein basically backing his theory. That's weird. It's very strange. Look at Hapgood's connection with the Cayce work. We have to start to understand that there's a scientific part and, there's an understanding on a certain level. Why are all these people on that elite shelf going around and creating this intense climate emergency situation? Well, certainly it's for control, but why are they freaking out beyond freaking out? Why are they exposing themselves to such a degree? What is it that we're coming into that they cannot stand the idea of losing control over? And the pole shift is actually a very good candidate, because it's something where even with the best, kind of underground barricades that they've set up and all that stuff that they've set up, to survive the underground bunkers for the elite. And we hear about them buying more and more of that stuff all the time. You got to wonder what they're up to. But, a pole shift, if you're in an underground bunker, a pole shift, you can't really defend against it. So it's a great leveler in that sense. So I think what can happen.
Okay, let me ask you a question though.
Yeah.
Okay, so if they know that there is a pole shift coming, and we know that they have these underground bunkers that are incredibly luxurious, and they have pools and bowling alleys and all that. I mean, it's a fact, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And they have all this food stored down, and they can simulate day and night. Why do they need to depopulate us on the surface? If they already know that they're going to survive it for years underneath, why do they have to terrorize us now? Why did they have to torture us?
Well, it's interesting because they have plans that run in cycles, 10-year plans, 50-year plans, and all the rest of it. So I think that there's different types of agendas, and I think that they have an incredible greed level. But I also think that some of them are not stable mentally. So, so we're looking at kind of the Dr. Strangelove type thing where their insanity grows and they think to themselves, like the 2012 movie, I'll repopulate, But it's interesting because in the movie, they land, like I said, in South Africa at the end, and it's like, it's a new dawn. But one of the things that Cayce had mentioned about South Africa is he said, You know, Livingston, Montana and South Africa must someday feed the world. It's one of those little things that just hangs out there in his canon of work. And you know, I pointed this out. Who situated the Church Universal Summit Lighthouse in Livingston, Montana? It's Elizabeth Clare Prophet. Somebody was listening out there. But then I go deeper with that one in my own mind, and I say, why Livingston, Montana? What would make Livingston, Montana feed the world? And then South Africa, you know. So other Cayce readings mention Saskatchewan. So maybe somebody can do the geography there, but it's pretty interesting, Livingston, Saskatchewan. So we start to get an image, a picture of it. I wanted to mention, since I brought a lot of predictions with me, which I didn't get to tonight, but for the heck of it, I'll mention this one. This one comes from the Transcenders. It was a group that I was lucky enough to meet before their channel. Rick Thurston passed away, unfortunately, in 2011 at a very young, well, I think he was 55. And so I was, you know, I really, I felt like his work was fascinating. And there was this whole situation I've mentioned before about this ex-NORAD guy, predicting this whole October 13th, 2010 UFO incident. And I got wind of it, and then it actually came to pass. But anyway, the book that Stanley Fulham put out, called Challenges of Change, had some Earth changes predicted in it by the Transcenders. And I'll read a couple of these. Earth changes will bring massive political, economic, and social changes to the world. The Transcenders have access to the future probabilities in the Akashic records and confirm what the mystics and the Egyptian and the Maya have predicted. The time is near. The devastation is huge. No nation escapes its impact. The next decade will challenge mankind as never before. The demise of Atlantis was a continental destruction. Today's threats are worldwide. But out of that destruction, mankind will arise in a higher spiritual consciousness, which will enable us to meet the new challenges of the future and the interaction with alien worlds. This is Sydney. This is Stanley talking. The Transcenders reveal that there are no absolutes in the universe. There are only major and minor probabilities. But the Earth changes taking place now result from many different cyclical forces in the universe and hold a very high probability. And then here's the Transcenders speaking. A major Earth fault. They predicted they predicted the Fukushima incident, which I thought was fascinating. And they nailed down the time between 2010 and 2012, and it was 2011. So they really, they were dialed in on that somehow. And what they say this is happening, and what will happen is lands disappear and new lands appear. This is, again, lands rising. So we need to be on with this, because for some reason, this part of it, you know, has gone in the general idea of the media. We only hear about, you know, oh, things are going to be inundated. But we need to get our heads wrapped around land rising, because it's crucial. It's a concept they follow, as you know. Cayce predicted Japan would be totally inundated. So will other nations. The eastern seaboard of China, including the large industrial center of Shanghai, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the Koreas, will suffer major devastation and total inundation. In some areas, large parts of Europe will experience massive inundations, and so will the lower levels of the Americas. Coastlines throughout the world will suffer destruction in various degree. The earthquakes in Haiti and Chile, as tragic as they were, are the precursor to greater earth changes that will follow. As a result of these earthquakes, there is now the probability of the earthquake in Japan. And then they predict the earthquake that happens in Japan. So then there's another piece here, and it says, Stanley asked them, the Transcenders have indicated earlier that Atlantis will rise again in this particular area. Is that what's happening? Bimini. It will rise in that particular area, yes. There will be some changes to that island, but the landmass will rise. Interesting. Stanley, the Atlantean crystal, which lies at the bottom of the ocean near Bimini, has caused the strong vibrational phenomena in the area known as the Bermuda Triangle, in which hundreds of airplanes and ships have disappeared. Has it anything to do with the Haitian earthquake? You remember the massive Haitian earthquake that took place. And the transcenders answer and say, yes, it's part of the triggering mechanism. At the moment, it is in a slight shift, but nothing major yet. It has reduced the intensity of the earthquake in Japan. It is still there. And then Stanley asks, how does the crystal affect the situation? That is the earthquake. The transcenders answered, it is a form of frequency vibration that over time has weakened the fault line. It does have a major impact. At the moment, the probability of a major earthquake in Japan is in the high 70s, but it may lessen depending on what happens. So he goes on basically to say that there's so much, the thoughts are things, and so many of the environmental changes, et cetera, again, depend on what we project out and how we handle it in our own minds. So there is this aspect that somehow we bring order out of chaos as well. But there again, in a more modern psychic, we have that inclination that there are some inundations and things that are coming up in the near future. So I think that we have to see it as a feature of the next 20 years, something that we're going to experience to some greater or lesser degree. Yes.
Sal A says they're desperate to control and depopulate the world before the Carrington event. First the Carrington event, then later the cataclysm. If we're still around when the Carrington event hits, then they will be killed by a human hunting. This is an interesting theory.
Why don't you answer that one?
No, just thinking about it. Brian D says, the Hopi said, near the day of purification, there will be cobwebs spun back and forth in the sky. A container of ashes might one day be thrown from the sky, which could burn the land and boil the oceans.
Whoa.
And Karen Carpenter says, does a solar flash tie in with the pole shift? Does the Bible say the sun will send energy to help us at some point? Does this take out the tech strangling us?
Well, that's an interesting point, which is if there were enough of a solar event, if there were a pole shift, it would be a great leveling, let's face it, because right now they, the leaders and the movers and the shakers in this society have developed a stranglehold over humanity, and they have an unusual advantage because of the extreme technology. That's one of those things that I had in that conversation with RFK Jr., where he said, with the satellite technology, you can't even run for the hills anymore. So there's nowhere to go. Facing this on and demanding that this go in a better direction and demanding of those leaders that they do something is, that's really where it's at right now. But I would say for sure, there is a great leveling in the technology being upset. The question is just a general thing in relation to natural disasters, but the society itself, of course, needs to work more in cooperation. And
oh God, is it ever?
So, the strength of the mystery schools and the fourth way schools coming forward and saying, working groups of 100 people, and networks of people, seems to me something very appropriate for the time that we're in. And I would say with what they pulled with the COVID op, and as I said, I think what they have coming up with the UFO threat op, we don't, the level of which they're capable, just think, it was only a year and a half ago that they were saying, stay in your house. So, I don't trust these people. I mentioned to Olivia that, they have all these commercials about, these various luxury things that people can do. And I'm like, I don't buy into things since the pandemic. Like I look at a lot of things as basically them trapping humanity now. They've lost, they really lost a lot of trust, I think, from people. And there's something very artificial about the world that they've brought back from the pandemic, which they artificially created these kind of slave type conditions. So I think a lot of people are aware of it. I think it is being called out in a number of quarters: medical, scientific, political, and economic. And I think that voice is getting stronger. I feel that voice is getting stronger. And I think with the elections, we'll find a lot of the people who supported it are going to get thrown out in November. So there is going to be quite a major echo from all this. And that's why I think you're seeing weird things like, the Biden group, raiding ex-President Trump. It was just weird, the things that they're pulling. And so we're in that door right now. And with that, Miss Olivia, we have one question left.
Well, this is a good one. Dorothy Gorska-Taya says, are they even people? This is something that we've discussed. If they are, they're clinically insane, right? And so whether they are actually like Homo sapiens, or if they are, then they're clinically insane. And either way, we don't really need to listen to them and respect them and their quote authority, because they've proven themselves to be completely irresponsible with power. And that is what matters. I mean, we can't prove one way or the other who they actually are, but we can see that the malfeasance, the negligence,
indeed,
and so what we do about that is the question. But none of these people deserve our respect or our allegiance, our loyalty, our tax dollars, any of it.
The leadership is so it doesn't reflect the people at all at this point. At this stage, it's interesting too, because I feel like humanity is ready for a better set of leaders. But what's interesting to me is that they've become disconnected from their conscience. So Jacinda, before the UN being like, free speech is a weapon of war and we have to control who uses it. I mean, you're nuts, you're a Nazi. What do you want me to say? Like, I'm sorry that you joined this Nazi force. And it's the same thing with, the premier of Canada and with the crazy governor of California. These people are being told something that you'll be backed, we'll back you up. And so they're willing to be the crazy in order to do it.
I don't know. I think they're really crazy. I've been really they don't seem rational to me. I mean, I think they are sociopaths.
Yes.
And that alone, which is why they've been chosen for those jobs, but they are, they're not trustworthy human beings. Would you trust your child with them? If you have a 4-year-old child, would you leave them with any of these leaders as a babysitter? If not, they don't deserve to be the leader of any damn country.
Oh, there's so few people in the Senate. I mean, Johnson is a great senator. Rand Paul. We have some good people. But they're so few and far between. It's remarkable.
Because they don't get the funding.
I agree. I agree. All right. I'm going to read one quick quote and then we're done.
Okay.
Here we go. Ready? Did the appearance of what became the 5 races occur simultaneously? This is a Cayce question and answer. And he says it occurred at once. And then they say, are the following the correct places? Atlantean, the red race. And he says Atlantean and American, the red race. And they say Upper Africa for the black. And he said, what would be known now as the more western portion of Upper Egypt for the black? You see, with the change, when there came the uprisings in the Atlantean land and the sojourning southward, with the turning of the axis, the white and yellow races came into more the portion of Egypt, India, Persia, and Arabia. The turning of the axis. There it is again, that echo that we've been through this before. And I hope it's the kind of future that we can navigate away from that reality. But this idea of a pole shift, some kind of cataclysm, it seems like there is that, echo back there warning us. Whether that's in 20 years or 200, I don't know, but there's some resonance back there that's trying to let us know these are the important times. And with that, Miss Olivia,
hold on. Let's end on a positive note. Karen Carpenter says, how does our collective vision of peace impact the outcome? Thoughts from mystery schools? Intention is the key, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Well, thoughts are things. There's no question about it. And I think we've been asked to consider the changes and how, we can bring about the good reality for the upcoming future. But we are asked to consider the pole shift. We're asked to consider the earth changes. They've come through and suggested these things may be a part of the future. How will we deal with it? So these may be the challenges, but if we are aligned properly, there's no question that there's no challenge that we can't handle. Absolutely. And I 100% agree with that. And thoughts are things. And, that's important because we bring the order out of chaos. And I guess that's the great lesson that they've left for us.
And I think there's, I need to study more about the Heart Math Institute. And I think, but our ability to basically vibrate from our feeling center, from our heart center, is much more powerful than what we think of or even what we say. So meditating from our heart space, really connecting to that and radiating that. If we want to make a difference in this world, that seems to be the place that we can do it.
Oh, no question. And we had some great examples and some great people who've left us an incredible track record of courage in creating this incredible legacy for us to look at these things and not be spiritually in the dark. And there's nothing better than that. With that, Miss Olivia, fantastic.
I have a bunch of people to thank.
Please do.
Okay, so Bob Bennett, Gillenjoy R, Wait a Minute 72, a cult fan, Eurythmy is Fun, Dorothy Gorska Tyus, Jim Sarge 3ID, Jen Passavant, David Baker, NM, Robert Scott, Les Scott, Medley Childress, CT, Bob Bindert, Shazam, Erica Swinson Elliott, Sarah Jane, James Cregan, Karen Carpenter, and Thomas Tyson. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Outstanding. We really appreciate your support. It helps us to do the things that we do here for this program. And I want to say to all the people who've contributed tonight and to all our subscribers that we couldn't do what we do here without you. So thank you for backing us up and letting us continue. And we hope to do it for many, many, many or more years for you. I'll do a couple of shout outs and we're out of here. I see Gigi Young out there. Fantastic. We're going to get Gigi back soon. She just did an incredible two-parter. Off the charts, Scarlet Fire. Oh, right.
Has Gigi ever done a spider show?
That's a good question.
If not, she should.
We're going to have to ask her on that one. But that is pretty interesting. I have to say the Steiner spiders got me going. I like that. Whiskey's mom. There we go. Fantastic. Deborah Sloan. Tommy Connolly. Wiccan. Fantastic crew. Great questions and the ideas from. Bravo, Miss Olivia, for bringing them forward.
There were so many that I couldn't get to, but I can't wait to read through the comments section. It's going to be amazing.
You could just tell. Wolf Mother, great show. DJ and Olivia, thank you very much. Let's see here. Danielle Jorgensen, we'll be counting the hours. Peace out, everybody. I like that. John Doe. Jordan Banner, thoughts are things that you manifest. Yes, that's exactly. You nailed the idea exactly. And every time I run across it, it becomes more and more profound to think about. I remember that there's one reading where they asked Cayce, well, are thoughts really things? And he says, as real as a pin in the hand. Well, that's pretty real. So we have to really, that's something. And I also think that in matter, things have caught up so that the way that, the nutational rate of us thinking, the actual vibration manifests something. So it is important for us to have a good attitude. I've known that my whole life. And I've seen people at various levels of it, but, it's a great thing for us to understand. It's a great advantage. No question about it. I had an interview with a golfer. I'm trying to think of the guy's name, but he was a great golfer, and he was like, I always picture the ball going in. It's one of those things.
You know what? I'm going to, on
Moments
that note,
divine. Yes.
I'm going to share something Pam Gregory shared a couple times.
Yes.
She said that, the great karate trick where you break wood with your hand.
Yes.
Okay, you cannot do it if you focus on the wood. You have to actually focus on the space underneath the wood of your hand going through it afterwards, basically. So, and it doesn't hurt you if you do it that way. You can break it. So it's where you want your hand to go. It's the same thing like with an arrow, where you don't, that's it. So it's a great metaphor for life. If you focus on the obstacle, you are hindered by that obstacle and you are hurt by the obstacle. If you focus on where you want to get to, your objective past the obstacle, you can get there.
Wow.
I love that lesson.
I've seen a lot of examples of it too. I've noticed people who drive well tend to have a lot of discipline over their thinking. That's one thing I picked up on. I don't know why it's true, but it is true. Maybe it's that focus they developed. Thanks, Gigi. Someone said, hey, it's Najat. Good night, Cold Aussie, wherever you are. Fantastic show, guys. See you all next week. We will see you next week. We'll be here. Wow. Great crew tonight. Outstanding questions. Let's see if I got everybody. Rochelle Waters, Nelson Chandler, please bring Dr. Joseph Farrell on ASAP. Yes, absolutely.
I think a lot of Freeland, it's probably time for her to bring her back.
She's fantastic. I can't wait to talk to her. I'm still going through her book. She wrote the most massive tome, and it's so informative. And when I get through it, I'm going to feel like I've really accomplished something. Awesome show tonight. Thank you very much. Books. I'll just mention books real quickly. Cayce on Atlantis, the Philadelphia Experiment. Very interesting indeed. Earth Changes Update is a Cayce book. That's from 1990. There was the thing about Alternative 3 that I didn't get to, but hey. And all kinds of good stuff.
Alternative 3?
It's too good. I'll save it. Okay. I'll save it and savor it for sure. Under Destroyer, Handy Jones, we're the cool kids. I like that. I think we'll go out on that note. And Esoteric Gold. Olivia said, damn, my virgin ears.
I said asshole earlier too.
Oh, you don't have to reiterate. That's okay.
Yes, I did.
Dawn of a New Day. Bring 107. Huh. Well, I don't think that's going to happen. Catherine Fitz is great also. Thank you. Good night, Dark Journalist. Good night. Younger Dryas 2.0. Hoagland. Richard Hoagland,
Can you get in touch with him? Or you
that? Yeah, absolutely. I will. His stuff has always been intriguing. Kay Grace, thank you very much. Wow, great. G. Taylor, Happy Hermit, fits for president. 333, Esther Taylor, Lovely Sheep. Thanks, DJ and Olivia. You guys rule. Thanks, chat room. Love you all. Tim Houston, like that one. Everyone, thank you so much for being with us. Outstanding to have everyone here with us. And of course, you all make a great difference in everything that we do. We will see you all next week. Have a fantastic weekend, and you may be looking at some interesting special reports between now and then with everything that's going on. And it says end broadcast after all, Miss Olivia, but
never really ends.
Never really ends. We'll see you all next week.